We've mapped the surface of Mars in better detail than our own ocean floor. So when somebody comes back from deep water saying they saw something they can't explain, you can't just wave it off, because nobody actually knows what's down there. Tonight, I've got 3 stories from people who found out. A delivery captain whose depth sounder picks up something enormous rising beneath his boat, in water 3 miles deep. A woman sailing alone across the Indian Ocean who rescues a man from a life raft, then realizes far too late what she's brought aboard. And a skeptic commercial diver, 190 feet under an oil platform at night, who meets something at a sealed hatch that speaks to him, in his own voice. Before we begin, if you enjoy scary stories, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and follow the podcast wherever you listen, so you never miss a new episode. Turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and let's begin. I've been delivering boats for other people for about 16 years now. It's a strange little corner of the sailing world that most people don't know exists. Somebody buys a catamaran in Fort Lauderdale and wants it in the Virgin Islands, and instead of sailing it there themselves, they pay a crew to do it for them. That crew is me and whoever I bring along. I've crossed the Gulf Stream more times than I can count, done the Atlantic twice, and spent more nights of my adult life offshore than in a bed that doesn't move. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what happened on this particular delivery did not happen to somebody who spooks easy. The ocean has thrown just about everything at me over the years, and I have an explanation filed away for almost all of it. Almost. The boat was a 41-foot catamaran, nearly new, and the run was Fort Lauderdale down to Tortola. Standard stuff. Roughly 1,000 miles, most of it through open Atlantic, and if the weather cooperates, you can do it in 7 or 8 days. My crew was Rennie, who I've sailed with for over a decade, and who is the single most unflappable human being I have ever met, and a younger guy named Marcus, who was building up his offshore miles and paid attention and didn't talk too much, which honestly is most of what I ask for in a third crew member. The first 4 days were about as good as ocean sailing gets. Steady wind on the beam, flying fish coming aboard at night. The 3 of us rotating through watches and eating too much pasta. Point is, everything was normal. Better than normal. On the 5th day, the wind started dying. That's not unusual out there. You're threading between weather systems the whole way down. And the forecast had shown a soft patch we'd have to motor through. By early evening, the wind was gone completely, and I mean completely. The sea went flat, not calm, flat. There's a difference, and if you've spent time offshore, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Even in a dead calm, there's usually some old swell rolling through from a storm 1,000 miles away, some texture on the water. This had none. The surface was smooth and still all the way out to the horizon in every direction, and the boat sat on it without moving at all. We started the engines and motored. Now here's the first thing I noticed, and at the time I gave it about 4 seconds of thought. The birds were gone. Out there you almost always have something. Shearwaters cutting across your wake, a tropic bird way up high, something. That evening there was nothing in the sky and nothing on the water. I remember mentioning it to Rennie and Rennie shrugging, and that was the whole conversation. High pressure sitting on top of us, dead air, birds off wherever the wind went. Fine. Around 10 that night, Marcus came and got me off my bunk because the depth sounder was reading 300 feet. I want to explain why that's strange. We were in the middle of the Atlantic basin. The charted depth under us was over 15,000 feet. A depth sounder in water that deep doesn't read anything at all. It just shows blank. Because the bottom is miles beyond what the transducer can reach. And ours had been blank for 3 days. But I wasn't worried, because I'd seen this before, and this is the part where I'm going to sound smart right before I stop sounding smart. There's a real phenomenon called the deep scattering layer. It's a huge blanket of small fish and squid and plankton that sits down around 1,000 or 2,000 feet during the day and rises toward the surface at night to feed. It's so dense that sonar bounces off it, and it's famous for creating a false bottom on depth sounders. In the Second World War, it confused entire navies. So I looked at that 300-foot reading, and I told Marcus about the scattering layer, and I told him it was one of the coolest things in oceanography, and he'd just seen it for himself. And I went back to my bunk, genuinely pleased with the whole thing. An hour later, Rennie woke me up. Rennie does not wake people up. The sounder was reading 140 feet, and it had been reading 140 feet, steady, for 40 minutes. Here's the thing about the scattering layer. It's alive, and it's patchy, and it drifts. A reading off the layer wanders. It thins out, breaks up, jumps around, disappears and comes back. What it does not do is hold one number, rock steady, for 40 minutes while your boat is motoring forward at 6 knots. For the reading to hold that steady, whatever the sonar was bouncing off had to be moving with us, underneath us, matching our course and matching our speed. I stood at the helm and looked at that number for a long time. Then I did the only test I could think of. I pulled the throttles back to neutral and let the boat coast down to a stop. The number started dropping, 130, 120. It wasn't that we were drifting over a rising seamount because we weren't moving. We were sitting dead still on dead flat water in the middle of the night, and the distance between our hulls and whatever was below us was getting smaller. It was coming up, slow, a few feet a minute. The three of us stood in the cockpit not talking, watching a number, and I will never forget the particular quality of the quiet out there. No wind, no swell, no birds, no slap of water on the hulls. The only sounds in the entire world were the little electronic tick of the instruments and the three of us breathing. At 100 feet, Marcus asked me what it was, and I gave him some answer about the layer clumping up, and he looked at me, and I understood that neither of us believed it, and I said it anyway because saying it out loud was doing something for me. At 80 feet, the smell reached us. I've smelled dead whales at sea before. This wasn't that, but it lived in the same neighborhood, something deep and old and biological, coming up through air that hadn't moved in hours. My stomach turned over before my mind had settled on anything to be afraid of. That's the truth of it. The body votes first out there. At 60 feet, Rennie spoke. Rennie had been sailing since before I was born, had been through 2 hurricanes at sea, and in 11 years I had never once heard a single thing come out of that mouth that wasn't flat and calm. It was still flat and calm. That was the worst part. Start the engines. I started the engines, and the second, those propellers bit the water. The number moved, fast, 50, 45, not falling away from us, closing. Then the boat rose. There was no wind and no sea, and we rose anyway, both hulls together, a long, smooth lift, the way a boat rides up the face of a swell. Except there were no swells. The water around us bulged upward in a low mound, maybe 100 feet across with us sitting on top of it, and I could hear water beginning to run off the edges of it in the dark, pouring quietly back down into the flat ocean on all sides. I pushed both throttles to the stops. The boat came down off the mound and the stern dug in and we ran. I don't have a better word for what we did. We ran, full power, both engines screaming, in a straight line through absolute blackness. And I stood there gripping the wheel and staring at the sounder, while Rennie stared aft into the dark, and Marcus held onto the cockpit table with both hands and nobody said one word. 30 feet. It read 30 feet for maybe 10 seconds. I have thought about those 10 seconds nearly every day since. Then 60, then 100, then 200, 300, 400, and then the screen went blank and the bottom was 15,000 feet down again, and there was nothing underneath our boat but 3 miles of empty black water, the way it was supposed to be. We ran the engines flat out for another hour anyway. Just before dawn, the surface of the ocean picked up its first ripple of returning wind, and I promise you I have never in my life been so glad to see texture on water. By sunrise we had 15 knots on the beam and shearwaters over the wake, and the whole world had come back, and the three of us sat in the cockpit in the morning light drinking coffee with hands that weren't completely steady. We made Tortola 3 days later without another strange minute the whole way. Now I know what you're thinking, because I've thought it all myself, 100 times over. Instrument malfunction, air bubbles under the transducer, a whale, and I'll tell you what I told myself. The sounder tested perfect at the dock in Tortola and worked flawlessly for the owner afterward. Bubbles don't hold a steady reading for 40 minutes and then track a boat that's changing speed. And I've been around whales my whole working life. Whales breathe. Whales surface. Whales show themselves. Whatever spent that night underneath us never once broke the surface, and it was reading on that sonar as something wide enough to lift a 100-foot circle of ocean with our boat on top of it. I only ever told this story to one person outside the boat, an old delivery skipper I've known for years, a man with twice my miles, sitting at a bar in St. Martin. I laid the whole thing out and waited for him to laugh at me. He didn't laugh. He looked at his drink for a while, and then he asked me one question. He asked whether the birds had left before it started. I said yes. He nodded and paid his tab and told me the birds always know first, and that was the entire conversation, and he has never brought it up again, and neither have I. I still do deliveries. I still love the work. But I check the charts differently now, and when the wind dies all the way out in deep water, I don't wait around admiring the calm. I start the engines, and I keep moving, and I watch the sky until I see a bird. To this day, I have no idea what was under that boat. I don't think I want to know. Some part of me is certain that the only reason I'm here telling you this is that it decided we weren't worth the last 30 feet. People ask me sometimes why a retired school teacher in her 60s would want to sail across the Indian Ocean by herself, and I've noticed that the question is never really a question. It's a polite way of suggesting I shouldn't. So let me deal with that first, because you'll need to understand who I am for the rest of this to make sense. I taught high school English for 31 years. My husband Tom taught geography down the hall for most of those same years, and every June, when the last bell rang, we'd load up the car and go somewhere neither of us had been. That was the deal we made when we got married, and we kept it for 4 decades. Sailing came late for us. Tom turned 50 and decided he wanted to learn, and I went along to the lessons mostly to keep him company, and then somewhere in that first summer it stopped being his thing and became ours. We bought a boat, a tired old 36-foot sloop that we spent 3 years fixing up, and we named her Vesper, which was my choice because it means evening prayer and because I liked how it sounded on the radio. The plan we talked about for years, the big one, the retirement dream, was to sail her across an ocean. We got as far as choosing which one. The Indian Ocean, the trade wind route, because Tom had taught about those winds for 3 decades off a laminated map and said he wanted to feel them push our own boat for a change before he got too old to steer it. He died 4 years ago. It was quick, which people tell me is a mercy, and slow enough for goodbyes, which actually is one. I won't dwell on that here. I'll only say that after a year of sitting in a quiet house being handled gently by everyone I knew, I went down to the marina, took the winter cover off Vesper, and understood that I was going to do the crossing anyway. Not as a tribute. Nothing so grand. It's just that we had a deal about going places, and I wasn't ready for the deal to be over. So that's who I am. Or that's who I was 3 years ago anyway, when I was 63 years old and 9 days out from the Cocos Keeling Islands, alone, bound west across 2,000 miles of open ocean toward a little speck called Rodriguez. Anyways, let me tell you about the 9th day. Solo passage making sounds dramatic and mostly isn't. It's housekeeping. You trim the sails, you check the rigging, you fix your little breakages, you cook your one hot meal, you sleep in short stretches, and you talk to yourself a good deal more than you'd admit at dinner parties. My one bit of genuine social life out there was the radio net. Every morning at 8 o'clock, all the cruising boats scattered across that stretch of ocean would check in on the long-range radio with a man named Graham, a retired air traffic controller in Western Australia who ran the net from his garden shed, and one by one we'd give our positions and our weather and whatever small news we had. Graham had a voice you could set your watch by. I'd give my report, and I always ended it the same way, every single morning, which had started as a joke in week 1 and calcified into ritual. Vesper out, keeping the kettle on. And Graham would chuckle the same half chuckle, and that was my society for the day. and honestly, it was enough. Day 9 was a beautiful morning. 15 knots of wind behind me, long easy swell, flying fish scattering off the bow. I'd done the net, eaten my porridge, and I was sitting in the cockpit with tea, doing absolutely nothing useful, when I saw a fleck of orange on the top of a swell about a mile off to the south. You'd be surprised what floats around out there in the middle of nowhere. Fishing buoys mostly, crates. Once, an entire refrigerator, door open, absolutely thriving with barnacles. So I watched the orange thing without much excitement, and it went down into a trough and came back up, and the second time it came up I got the binoculars on it. It was a life raft. Canopy up, drogue out, riding properly. And there was a man in the doorway of it waving at me. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, and what I felt was not fear. It was a sort of electric seriousness. Every sailor carries a private catalog of the things they hope they'll do right if the day ever comes, and finding a survivor at sea is at the very top of that catalog. And the feeling was, here it is, don't fumble it. I started the engine, dropped the headsail, and worked my way over to him, talking out loud to myself the whole time the way I used to talk my way through a fire drill with a classroom of teenagers. Slow and calm and one thing at a time. Getting a grown man out of a raft and onto a sailboat in open swell is genuinely hard, and I'll spare you the full 20 minutes of it, but we managed. He came over the stern on the boarding ladder, and I got him sat down in the cockpit, and I got water into his hands, and I finally had a proper look at the man the ocean had handed me. He was somewhere in his 50s, sun-browned, gray stubble, deep lines around his eyes, barefoot, in shorts and a faded shirt, and he was calm. He drank the water slowly, in small sips, which is exactly the right way for a dehydrated man to drink, and then he looked around the cockpit and up at the rig with a slow, appraising sweep, the look of a man taking inventory, and then he looked at me. "Thank you," he said. Quiet voice, even. "Vesper, that's a pretty name." I remember being pleased that he'd noticed her name. It's painted across the stern. He'd have seen it coming aboard. He said his name was Michael. He said his yacht had gone down in a storm, holed by something in the water, a container maybe, and that it had sunk fast, and that he'd been in the raft ever since. I asked him how long. 39 days, he said. 39 days. I remember the number landing on me with real weight. People have survived far longer in rafts. The record is months. But 39 days alone in a rubber ring in the Indian Ocean is an enormous thing, an ordeal. And I looked at this composed, quiet man sipping water in my cockpit, and I felt something in my chest that I can only call awe. I told him it was over now. I told him I'd get him to Rodriguez. He smiled and thanked me again, and asked, mildly the way you'd ask about the weather, whether I was sailing alone. I said yes. Of course I said yes. There is no plausible way to pretend otherwise on a 36-foot boat. And besides, why would I have wanted to? The man was a survivor. I was his rescuer. That was the entire shape of the world that morning. I gave him food, small amounts, and the sea berth to rest in, and I got the raft hauled up on deck and lashed down, because a raft is evidence and salvage, and you don't just cut it loose. And it was while I was lashing it down that the first little pebble dropped into the pond, though I didn't hear the splash at the time. The raft was clean. I don't mean tidy, I mean clean. I'd read the survival accounts. Tom and I read all of them, cheerful bedtime stories for sailors. And a raft that's been drifting for a month is a living thing. Gooseneck barnacles fringing the waterline, algae slicking the underside, the canopy bleached chalky by the sun, the fabric chafed where it's worked against itself through thousands of swells. This raft's canopy was still a deep factory orange. The underside, when I'd hauled it up, was smooth. 6 weeks in tropical water, and the ocean hadn't grown so much as a whisker on it. And here's what I did with that observation, because I want you to see that I wasn't a fool, or at least not an obvious one. I explained it. Rafts are made of materials designed to resist fouling. Maybe it had been resurfaced right before his trip, fresh coatings, all of it new. Maybe 39 days just looks different than the books say. What was I going to do? Accuse a half-starved shipwreck survivor of insufficient barnacles? I finished my lashings and went below and made the man soup. He ate half of it. He set the rest aside, politely, and said his stomach needed to come along slowly. Which is, again, exactly correct. Everything about him was exactly correct. That first night I kept my usual routine, sleeping in the cockpit in stretches with my kitchen timer, letting him have the good berth below. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I woke for my check, and I looked down the companionway, and he was sitting upright at the chart table in the dark, not doing anything, not reading, not eating, not moving, sitting with his hands flat on the table, facing the companionway, facing me. "Can't sleep," he said before I'd said a word. 39 days of drifting. The body forgets how. And that made sense. I want you to notice how it made sense, because everything he ever said made sense. Sleep disturbance after an ordeal, of course, naturally. I told him there was chamomile in the galley, and I went back to my cockpit and my timer, and I lay there awake a good while longer than I meant to, without quite being able to say why. The second day was fine. I'll say that plainly. It was fine. He came up in the morning, moved around the boat carefully, asked intelligent questions about her, complimented my reefing setup. He was good company in a muted way, but I started noticing that his questions had a direction to them. Not obviously. Each one on its own was small talk. But laid end to end, over the course of a day, they made a line, and the line pointed at one thing. Who knew where I was? Did I file a float plan? Was anyone meeting me in Rodriguez? Did my family track my position? That radio net I talked to in the mornings, did they take positions, or was it just chat? Did boats ever miss a check-in? What happened if they did? I answered honestly, because the questions came at me hours apart, wrapped in ordinary conversation, and each one seemed natural in its moment. Yes, the net logged positions. Yes, Graham noticed when boats went quiet. My daughter had my rough route. People would miss me, I said, laughing, within about a day. He nodded along warmly. Good, he said. That's smart. A lot of people just vanish out here, you know. Nobody's fault. The ocean's big. That night I woke at my 3 o'clock check, and he was in the companionway, standing on the steps, half in and half out, facing the cockpit, his head and shoulders in the starlight. I honestly don't know how long he'd been there. When my eyes opened, he was already looking at me, and he didn't startle, and he didn't look away, and he didn't explain. He said he was getting some air. Then he went below. I did not sleep again that night. I lay in the cockpit doing what I imagine you're doing right now, going back through everything with the lights on, the clean raft, the full water jugs I'd found lashed in it, which I'd read as discipline, rain catchment, a careful man rationing well. The flares all present, his skin weathered but whole, no salt sores, no boils, none of the ruin that 39 days of wet and sun writes on a body. The soup he never quite finished, the sleep that never came. Any one of those things explainable. I'd explained them. I'd been explaining things for 2 days straight, and I was starting to hear the sound of my own explanations. And it was the sound of a woman talking herself past something her body had already decided. Because that's the truth of it. My body knew first. Somewhere on the second day, without consulting me, it had started keeping him in front of me. I'd stopped turning my back to him in the cabin. I'd started wearing my rigging knife on my belt again, which I hadn't bothered with since the anchorage in Cocos, and I'd done it without letting myself think the reason. On the morning of the third day, the radio wouldn't transmit. Receive was fine. I could hear the net assembling, hear Graham's voice going down his list of boats, clear and cheerful. But when I keyed the microphone, the set strained and gave me nothing. No power out. I sat there at 8 o'clock hearing my name called, Vesper, Vesper, Graham calling Vesper, and hearing myself answer into a dead handset. And across the cabin, Michael sat with his tea, watching me with an expression of mild, appropriate sympathy. Salt air, he said. It gets into everything. Here's the thing about a marine radio. The weak point in a transmitting setup is usually the antenna connection, and mine ran through a tuner mounted in a cockpit locker. and I had gone through that connection with fine sandpaper and sealant and Cocos Keeling 10 days earlier. I had made it good. I knew I had made it good. I said something breezy about salt air being the price of the view, and I put on my reading glasses, and I went and opened the locker, and I looked. The antenna lead was backed off the tuner stud, not corroded, not broken, unscrewed, most of a full turn, sitting proud of its washer. And the sealant I'd laid over that fitting with my own hands was peeled aside in one neat flap. Vibration doesn't do that. Salt doesn't do that. Fingers do that. I want to tell you exactly what happened in my body in that moment, kneeling at that locker with my back to the companionway. My hands went cold, actually cold, in 90-degree air. There was a pressure in my ears the way there is before a squall, and every sound on the boat went very precise and separate. The water on the hull, the creak of the boom, and behind me, from the cabin, nothing. Silence with a man in it. I did not fix the connection. I closed the locker, and I stood up, and I complained, lightly to the morning in general, that the tuner had finally packed it in, and that we'd just have to be a surprise when we got to Rodriguez. My voice came out steady. 31 years in front of teenagers will give you that, if nothing else. You learn to keep the room. He said that was a shame. He said it kindly. I have gone back and forth for 3 years about whether what I did next was brave or stupid, and I've settled on this. It was neither. It was just the only move on the board. I needed to know what I was sharing a boat with, 800 miles from the nearest land. And the answer was folded into the one place I hadn't looked. The little gray ditch bag that had come aboard with him out of the raft, which lived beside the sea berth, and which he was never more than a few steps from. Except that afternoon, for the first time, he went forward. Up to the bow, to look at the horizon, he said. I watched him settle against the mast, facing away, and I went down the companionway with my heart going in a way I could feel in my back teeth, and I opened his bag. Water rations, fishing kit, a knife, which I'd expected and still didn't enjoy seeing, a folded chart, a photocopy actually, of the Western Indian Ocean, with pencil lines on it that I didn't have time to study, and then, at the bottom, a Ziploc pouch, and in the pouch 2 wallets, 2. I'm going to tell you what was in them, and I'm going to tell it flatly, because that's how it hit me. Kneeling on the cabin sole of my own boat, with one eye on the companionway, and my hands not entirely under my command. The first wallet held a driver's license belonging to a man named Raymond, 61 years old, an address in New Zealand, a face that was not the face on my bow. The second held cards in the name of a man called Dennis, a French license, 58, also not him. And beneath the wallets, loose in the pouch, was a woman's ring, a thin gold band with 3 small stones, worn smooth on the inside from decades on the same finger. 39 days, he'd said. Alone since his yacht went down, he'd said. Then whose lives were these? Zipped in plastic at the bottom of his bag. I heard his weight come off the foredeck. I had the bag closed and stowed and myself standing at the galley filling the kettle by the time his shadow crossed the companionway. And I will tell you that filling that kettle, keeping my hands slow, keeping my shoulders loose, was the hardest physical work I have ever done in my life. He came down the steps. He stopped, and I felt him stand there behind me, longer than a man stands for no reason, and the water ran, and my heart hit the walls of me, and then he moved past to the sea berth and said something pleasant about the wind holding. To this day, I don't know if I left something an inch out of place. I don't know if he knew that afternoon, or suspected, or simply lived in a permanent state of watching. It didn't matter. The situation was now perfectly clear, and it was this. I was alone in the middle of an ocean with a man carrying dead men's wallets. My transmitter was sabotaged, and he believed, because I'd cheerfully told him so, question by harmless question, that if I went silent, the alarm would take days to raise, and the search would come to a patch of empty water. The ocean's big. Nobody's fault. He had told me the whole shape of it himself, on day 2, in the warm voice of a man discussing the news. A lot of people just vanish out here. Here is where I stopped being a rescuer and started being a teacher again, because a classroom teaches you one great truth, You can be terrified of a person and manage them anyway, so long as they don't know which one you're doing. So I managed him. I kept our little routines. I cooked, I trimmed, I chatted. I complained about the radio at believable intervals. I let him hear me tell the empty air that my daughter was going to be furious when I turned up out of contact. And I waited for the one window I knew came every day, the half hour each afternoon when he went to the head, and then lay in the sea berth with his eyes shut, not sleeping, never sleeping, but stationary, behind a drawn curtain. On the second afternoon after the wallets, in that window, I went to the cockpit locker with a screwdriver in my waistband, and with the boat rolling and my ears straining backward at the companionway the whole time, I set the antenna lead back on its stud and turned it down tight and pressed the sealant flat again so it showed nothing. The transmitter was alive, and he didn't know it. The next morning at 8 o'clock, I sat at the chart table with him 4 feet away drinking his tea, and I keyed the microphone for the first time in 4 days, and I heard Graham's voice snap to attention across 2,000 miles. "Vesper, there you are, we've been calling." And I laughed a big, easy laugh and blamed my tuner and my own poor soldering, and I gave my position, and I said brightly that I had wonderful news, that I'd picked up a survivor from a raft, one soul, in good health, and there was a pause on the frequency that told me every boat on that net had just sat up straight. And then I finished my check-in. And instead of the words I had said every morning for 9 years of sailing that boat, instead of keeping the kettle on, I said this: "Vesper out, tell Tom I'm fine." 4 feet away, the man who called himself Michael sipped his tea and looked mildly pleased for me. The radio was silent for 2 seconds, maybe 3. My husband has been dead for years. Graham knew that. Graham had sat on that frequency the whole first crossing while I sailed with the Ashes, and Graham was a man who had spent 30 years as an air traffic controller listening for the one wrong word in a routine transmission. "Copy that, Vesper," he said, and his voice never changed at all. "I'll pass it along. Stand by for the weather." There was no weather scheduled at that hour. I stood by. What Graham did with the next several hours, I only learned properly in Rodriguez. But I'll give it to you straight rather than make you live my 2 days of guessing. He worked the problem exactly the way you'd hope. He came back at intervals with ordinary-sounding questions a chatty net controller might ask. Was the survivor a big fellow? Did he need medications? Would I like Graham to notify anyone? And I gave ordinary-sounding answers with the man sitting in my cabin, and between my lines and his, Graham built the picture. Then he got on the telephone to the maritime rescue people in Australia and Mauritius, and the rescue people did the one thing I could never have arranged for myself. They found a ship. She was a bulk carrier, the Alcyone, 200 meters of her, riding empty from Singapore towards South Africa, and she altered course that evening to pass through my square mile of ocean. The official framing, which Graham relayed over the net in his flattest weather report voice, was that the vessel would take my survivor aboard for proper medical assessment, standard procedure, as a solo sailor could not be expected to care for a rescue casualty for another week at sea. All very routine. I watched Michael's face while that transmission came through, and I saw it, just once, just for a second. The surface came off, not anger, calculation. His eyes went to the radio, and then to me, and then out the companionway to the empty horizon, and I watched him take stock of a board that had been quietly rearranged, while he thought he was the only one playing, and I kept my own face in an expression of delighted relief, and clapped my hands and said, "Wasn't that marvelous?" A hot shower and a doctor for him, and he looked at me for a long moment. "Marvelous," he said. "The last 18 hours were the longest of my life. I won't dress that up. He was courteous. I was cheerful. Neither of us slept, and both of us knew the other wasn't sleeping, and the boat sailed herself west through a beautiful night while 2 people sat very still inside her, pretending together. I kept the cockpit. I kept the knife on my belt. Near dawn he came up the companionway and stood watching the stars fade, and he asked me, in the same mild voice as every other question, the voice of a man asking about the weather, whether I'd ever fixed a radio that quickly before. "Salt air," I said. "It gets into everything." He smiled then. He actually smiled out at the ocean, and something in it was almost respectful, and neither of us said one more word about it. The Alcyone came up over the horizon at 2 the next afternoon, and she was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. A great rust-streaked wall of a ship, and she made a lee for me, and her crew ran a pilot ladder down her side, and there were many of them at the rail. Many. He gathered his gray bag. I'd returned everything to it exactly, wallets and ring and all, and said nothing, because my one job was to deliver him breathing into a crowd of witnesses and let the authorities open that bag themselves. He stepped from my deck to the ladder in a calm swell, easy and sure-footed, and then he paused, holding on, his face a few feet from mine across the water. "Thank you for the ride," he said, and then, quietly, pleasantly, "I hope somebody stops for you someday." Then he went up the ladder, and men in coveralls received him, and I fell away from that steel wall and put my bow west and shook for about an hour. I'll give you the ending in the plainest terms I can, exactly the way it was given to me across a desk in Port Louis by a soft-spoken maritime police inspector 3 weeks later. The raft on my foredeck had a serial number. The number traced to a 44-foot Australian yacht crewed by a married couple in their 60s, a retired dentist named Raymond and his wife. Raymond, whose driver's license I had held in my hands on the floor of my cabin. Their yacht had left Fremantle bound for Mauritius and had gone silent mid-ocean, no distress call, no debris, and had been posted missing. Its last radio contact was logged, dated, and filed, and I sat in that office while the inspector paged through the folder, and I did the sum in my head against the date I pulled a waving man out of the sea, and the space between those two dates was 39 days. He never lied about the number. He counted it honestly. It just wasn't his number. It was theirs, 39 days since anyone had heard Raymond's voice, and he wore it the way he wore everything else that had belonged to other people. The second wallet, Dennis, matched a Frenchman whose sloop had been found drifting and empty off the Chagos Bank the year before. Raft gone, no body ever recovered. And the man himself, the man I fed soup and gave my sea berth, matched the description, near enough, of a survivor picked up from a raft in the Coral Sea, some years earlier, under another name entirely, who had walked ashore from his rescuing vessel in Cairns and evaporated before anyone thought to check a single thing he'd said. They held him in Port Louis for a time, and then, because 2 wallets and a ring and a clean raft are a horror but not a case, and because no body from any of those boats has ever been found, and because he answered every question calmly and correctly, and his papers, whosever they had once been, were in order, they let him go. The inspector told me this with an apology in his face. Whereabouts unknown, case open. He shook my hand and told me I was a very fortunate woman, and I walked out into the sunshine of a harbor town where that man had also recently walked, and I looked at every face on the waterfront the whole way back to my dinghy. That was 3 years ago. I finished the crossing. I've done others since. I'm not done going places. That deal outlives everything. And people ask me, when they hear some version of the story, whether I'd still stop for a raft. Of course I would stop. You have to stop. The sea only works at all, because every one of us out there is sworn to every other, and one man in one raft doesn't get to burn that down. So yes, I'd stop tomorrow. But I sail differently now, in small ways that nobody would notice from the dock. My exact route lives with 3 people ashore, not general, exact. Graham and I have a real code now, agreed on paper, not improvised out of grief and luck. And I have never once, in 3 years, told a stranger on the water that I sail alone. Some nights on passage, at that 3 a.m. check, I still come awake with my eyes on the dark companionway, absolutely certain for half a second that there's a shape on the steps, half in and half out, watching me with all the patience in the world. There never is. The cabin is always empty, but he's out there somewhere. On some dock, in some anchorage, in some raft riding a swell with its canopy, a nice clean factory orange, waiting to be a fleck of color in somebody's binoculars. Somebody kind, somebody careful, somebody who read all the survival accounts, and always hoped that if the day ever came, they'd do it right. "I hope somebody stops for you someday," he told me. "People keep telling me it was a threat, and maybe it was. But I've had 3 years to turn it over, and I don't believe he was talking to me at all. I think he was saying his grace, because that's what stopping is, to a thing like him, the whole system he lives on, the oath the rest of us keep. And somewhere out on that enormous blue water right now, I promise you, somebody good is altering course toward a little orange raft with their heart going hard, hoping they don't fumble it. That's the part I carry, not the fear, the stopping. It's the best thing in us. He knows that too. It's what he's counting on." I'll be straight with you right from the top. I never believed in any of this stuff. Not ghosts, not omens, not any of it. I want that on the record, because the guys I used to work with would tell you the same thing about me. If you'd asked around the shop about who's the last man on the payroll to come home with a ghost story, they'd have said my name before you finished the question. That was my reputation. That was my whole personality, honestly. And I'd have been proud of it. So keep that in mind while I tell you what happened to me 190 feet under an oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico. Some background first, because most people have no idea my job even exists. I was a commercial diver for 11 years, not the fun kind. Not reefs and sea turtles. Commercial diving is construction work that happens to be underwater. You're a welder, a rigger, an inspector, a mechanic. You're just doing it in the dark, in a helmet that weighs about as much as a bowling ball, breathing gas that comes down a hose from the surface. That hose is called an umbilical, and it's your air, your comms, your heat, and your way home, all in one bundle. You learn to love that hose more than you love most people. I got into it at 22 because a guy at my gym wouldn't shut up about the money, and I stayed in it because it turned out I was good at it. I came up through inland work first. Bridges, dams, water intakes, black water jobs where you can't see your own gloves, and you do everything by feel. Then I got picked up by a company out of Louisiana doing offshore work, and that became my life. 3 weeks on, whatever off. Platforms all over the Gulf. The job that matters here was an inspection contract on a production platform about 100 miles off the Louisiana coast. I'm not going to name it. People still work out there, and it's not their fault what's under them. But I'll tell you about it, because the history is the whole story. The platform was old. It went in back in the 1970s, and it had been through 3 owners by the time I ever set foot on it. The company that built it and ran it first, I'll call them the old operator, had a logo you'd know if you were from the Gulf Coast and old enough. A pelican, diving, inside a circle. It used to be on signs and hard hats and coffee mugs all over that part of the world. It's not on anything anymore, and here's why. In the early 80s, that company had an accident on this exact platform. 3 men died in the water doing structural work down at the base, at one of the big concrete caissons the legs tie into. I've heard 4 different versions of what happened. A habitat flooded, a differential pressure thing, a bad gas switch. And I genuinely don't know which is true, because the company settled everything quiet and then got bought out a few years later, and the new owners painted over every pelican on that structure. New name, new colors, new safety record. That's how it works out there. The steel stays, the name changes. By the time I was working it, that accident was 40-some years old. It was a story the old hands told the new hands, the way every platform's got a story. And down at the base of the North Caisson, there was a sealed maintenance hatch, a steel access cover, welded shut, that supposedly led into the old work chamber where those men died. After the accident, the story went, the company pumped the whole chamber full of concrete. Sealed it, filled it, done. The hatch was just left there on the outside. A door on a wall with nothing behind it but solid concrete, 40 years deep. Divers being divers, everybody had something to say about that hatch. Guys would knock on it for a joke. One tender swore his diver heard knocking back, and everybody laughed at him for a full hitch. And I laughed the hardest, because that was my role in the ecosystem. I was the guy who kept everybody sensible. Anyways, the job. We were doing a full structural inspection. Welds, anodes, marine growth, the works, top to bottom on all the legs. Weeks of diving. My regular partner on that hitch was Curtis, and I want to spend 1 minute on Curtis because he matters to me. Big, quiet guy from Mississippi, 10 years older than me, hands the size of dinner plates. We'd been paired up on and off for 6 years. Underwater, we didn't even need the comms half the time. I could read his light. He could read mine. When you dive with a man that long, you develop something I don't have a good word for. Trust isn't strong enough. He's the other half of your nervous system. The dive I'm going to tell you about was a night dive, which sounds dramatic, and isn't. Below a certain depth, it's night all the time. The sun quits somewhere above you and never tells you when. We dove around the clock on that job. This one just happened to start around 11 at night, topside time. The task was simple. Curtis and I were going down the north leg to the caisson base, 190 feet, to finish cleaning and inspecting a row of welds. The platform had big underwater floodlights rigged down the structure for the job, so the work area had this yellow-green glow to it. Everything past the lights was black, not dark, black. Offshore black is its own color, and I'm not going to try to describe it to you beyond that. We splashed, we rode down the leg, we got on task. Normal night. Jeff was our supervisor on comms topside, 20 plus years in the saddle, voice made out of gravel and cigarettes. And he was running the dive the way he ran everything, half checklist and half insult comedy. I remember being in a good mood. I remember that specifically because of how completely the mood was about to leave my body. About 40 minutes in, we kicked up a silt out. My fault partly. I was jetting marine growth off a weld, and the current shifted, and the whole cloud came back on us. Happens all the time. Visibility went from 20 feet to 0 in about 4 seconds, and I mean 0. Glove against your faceplate 0. Standard procedure. Stop, settle, let it drift off. Curtis was maybe 15 feet from me when it closed in. I told Jeff we were silted out and holding. Jeff said copy, take a break, try not to die, the usual. And here's the thing about sitting in a silt out at night at 190 feet. There's nothing to do. You hold your position, you listen to your own gas, and you wait. Your world is the inside of your helmet. I've done it 100 times and it never bothered me once. It didn't bother me that night either. I want to be accurate. Nothing was wrong yet. I was bored, not scared. The silt started thinning after a few minutes. The floodlight glow coming back first, this green haze building around me. And as it cleared, I could make out the base of the caisson maybe 20 feet away, this huge concrete wall going up out of sight. I oriented on it, looked for Curtis's light, didn't see it, figured he was around the curve of the leg. Fine. I finned toward the caisson to reacquire my work area. And that's when I saw the other diver. He was down at the base of the wall, right where the concrete met the seafloor, kneeling, both knees on the bottom, hands resting on his thighs, facing the wall. Facing, I realized as I got my bearings, the old sealed hatch. Kneeling in front of it the way a man kneels at a fireplace. My first thought, and I want you to hear how boring my first thought was that the other shift had put a diver in the water without telling us, which would have been a safety violation and a half, and I was already composing the complaint in my head. My second thought was that it was Curtis, that he'd drifted over to the hatch during the silt out to screw with me, knock on the door, get a rise out of the skeptic. That would have been out of character for Curtis, but it was a better thought than the third one, so I held on to it. Then the water cleared another few feet and the details started arriving, and they arrived in the worst possible order. The suit was wrong. We were in modern gear, hot water suits, fiberglass helmets, everything yellow and black. This diver was in old equipment. I mean museum old. A heavy canvas-looking suit, dark rubber, and one of those big brass and copper-style helmets you see in antique shops. The round kind with the little porthole windows. Nobody has dived gear like that commercially in 50, 60 years. And on the chest of the suit, Stenciled in paint that was somehow still white was a circle, and inside the circle, a pelican, diving. I hung there in the water and looked at that logo, and I'm not ashamed to tell you my whole body went cold inside a suit that had hot water pumping through it. That's not a figure of speech. I felt the temperature of my own skin drop. The company that owned that logo hadn't existed since before I was born. The logo itself had been painted over, scraped off, erased from that platform on purpose, everywhere, 40 years ago. Okay, even then, I had an explanation, because I always had an explanation. That was my whole thing. Old gear gets used for stunts, for memorials, for film shoots, maybe some documentary crew, maybe a memorial dive for the accident, some anniversary thing nobody told the contractors about. Stupid explanation? Sure. But people do stupid things around water constantly. That's half of why my job existed. So I did what you do. I put my light on him, and I gave him the signal. Big, clear textbook. Are you okay? Identify. He didn't move. Kneeling. Facing the hatch. I keyed my comms and told Jeff, as level as I could manage, that I had another diver at the caisson base in vintage gear, and did topside know anything about it. And there was a pause, a real pause, and Jeff came back and told me to say again. So I said it again. Old suit, brass hat, kneeling at the north caisson by the sealed hatch. Jeff's voice changed. Not scared, careful. He said there was no other diver in the water. He said Curtis was on the other side of the leg, 40 feet from me, confirmed on his pneumo. He said everyone else was on deck and he was looking at all of them. And while he was saying it, the diver moved. The helmet came up first. Slow. The whole thing turned toward me in one smooth motion with no jerk in it anywhere, no adjustment, the way nothing underwater moves. Because underwater everything is correction. Everything is drift and fix. And this was one clean turn, a turret coming around. The little round faceplate pointed at me. Then he raised one arm and pointed at the hatch. And then he turned his hand over and beckoned me. Curled the fingers in, twice. Come here. I want to stop and tell you what I noticed in that moment, because this is the part that my training noticed before the rest of me caught up. There were no bubbles. A diver in that old gear is surface supplied. Every breath goes out through an exhaust valve and rises in a big silver column, constantly, the entire dive. It's the most alive-looking thing in the ocean, that column of breath. This suit had nothing. The water around that helmet was still, and there was no umbilical, no hose, no line, no nothing, running from the suit to anywhere. The suit just ended at the suit, 190 feet down, in equipment that cannot function without a hose, was a diver attached to nothing. Jeff was in my ear asking me what I was seeing, and I heard myself tell him, and my voice sounded normal, which amazes me to this day. Some professional layer of me was still filing reports, while the rest of me stood at the top of a very long staircase, feeling the first step start to tilt. Here's where I made the decision that I've turned over every night for years. I went closer, and I need you to understand why, because it's the only thing in this story I need you to understand. Everything I was looking at was impossible, and my brain, my good rational brain that I'd built my whole reputation on, took all that impossibility and assembled it into the one shape it could still accept. This is a man in trouble. Some poor guy in antique gear on some unauthorized stunt, out of air, cut loose, dying in front of me. Disoriented people do bizarre things. Dying divers kneel down. Every impossible detail could be a symptom of an emergency, and I had spent 11 years being the man who goes toward the emergency. That's the whole oath of the job. You go get him. So I went and got him. I finned in slow, 10 feet 8'6", announcing myself with my light, telling Jeff I was making contact, and Jeff telling me to hold off, wait for Curtis, and I heard him, and I kept going because the hand was still beckoning, patient. 2 curls of the fingers, over and over. At about 4 feet I got my light square on the faceplate. There was no face. I don't mean it was too dark to see one. My light was directly on the glass from an arm's length away. Behind that little round window there was water. Black water, moving. swirling in there, slow, with fine silt turning over in it, the way water moves in a jar you've just shaken. The suit was flooded, and it was kneeling, and it was beckoning, and my light was shaking on it now, because my hand had started shaking, and I watched my own beam tremble on that porthole of turning black water. And then something came up to the glass from the inside, pale, slow. It pressed flat against the inside of the faceplate, and my whole body was screaming face, braced for a face, and it wasn't a face. It was a hand, palm out, pressing on the glass from inside the helmet. White, wrinkled soft the way skin goes after too long in water, pressing flat and then dragging, slow, downward, the pads of the fingers squeaking against the inside of the glass, and I heard it. Through the water and the helmet and everything, I heard it. Everything after that happens fast, so I'm going to slow it down for you, the way it's slowed down for me 1,000 times since. The floodlights died. All of them. The whole rig's underwater lighting, gone in one beat, and 190 feet of ocean shut its eye. I had my hat light, a little cone of yellow reaching maybe 3 feet into pure black, and the kneeling thing was outside that cone now, somewhere to my left, 4 feet away in the dark. I keyed comms and I said the lights went, and nothing came back. No Jeff, no static even. And listen, comms fail all the time, but a dead channel has a sound, an absence. This wasn't absent. The channel was open. I could feel the line was live the way you can feel a person standing behind you in a dark room. And then, in my ear, breathing, wet breathing, close and slow, in and out, right against the microphone, on a hardwired channel that ran from my helmet up a hose to a panel where Jeff sat. There is no way in. There's no frequency to hijack. It's a wire. I hung there in the black, not moving, and the breathing went on, and then it stopped, the way breathing stops when someone's about to speak. And a voice said, "Don't leave me down here." It was my voice, not similar, not close, mine. I have heard my own voice on recordings my whole life and hated it the way everybody does. And that is what came through the wire, quiet, right in my ear, in the dark, wet at the edges, my voice begging me, "Don't leave me down here." The lights came back, all of them at once, the whole green-yellow world snapping back into existence, and I spun with my hands up, and there was nothing in front of me. The seafloor at the base of the caisson was empty. No diver. No disturbance in the silt where 2 knees had been planted for 10 minutes. Nothing. The hatch was open. That welded, painted-over 40 years sealed steel cover was standing off the wall on its hinges, swung all the way out. And where there should have been concrete behind it, where there was concrete behind it poured solid 4 decades ago, a fact I would have bet my license on an hour earlier. There was a passage, a dark opening going into the caisson, deeper than my light could reach from where I hung, with the floodlight glow falling off its edges into a black that didn't stop. Jeff's voice slammed back into my ear mid-shout, saying my name, saying he'd lost me for 2 minutes, get to the downline, dives over, and somewhere in there was Curtis's light coming around the leg toward me. And I want to tell you, I responded with crisp professionalism. I didn't. I ran. You can't run underwater, but everything in me was running, and I went up that structure with Jeff calling my ascent, and my heart going so hard I could hear it inside the hat. And at my first stop, because even in the worst moment of your life, 11 years of decompression training will grab you by the collar and hold you at your stop. That's how deep they put it in you. At that first stop, hanging on the line, I looked down. You always look down. That's the thing they can't train out of you. The hatch was a tiny, bright rectangle far below, lit up in the floodlights, and the diver was coming out of it. It came out of that opening low, onto the seafloor, on its hands. Palms down in the silt, arms moving one over the other, dragging the rest of the suit out of the hatch behind it, the empty legs of it trailing, and it crawled out along the bottom with this horrible fluency, this practice, and then it stopped. And the brass helmet, with its little window of turning black water, tilted back. It looked up at me, 150 feet of water between us. And I felt that the way you feel a hand on the back of your neck. I don't remember deciding anything after that. I remember Curtis's glove clamping on my harness at the next stop, him pulling his faceplate up against mine, his eyes asking, and me just shaking my head inside my hat, and him keeping that grip on my harness through every remaining minute of that decompression, all the way to the surface, without either of us saying a word about why. Topside was chaos in the quiet way offshore chaos happens. The lights failing had tripped alarms. Jeff had 2 minutes of dead comms on my channel and a heart rate to match. And I came out of the water, they tell me, gray. I gave my account in the dive shack with a cup of coffee shaking in my hand, the whole thing, every detail, to a room of men whose faces I will never forget, because they weren't laughing. That was the worst part. I was the skeptic. I was the guy. This should have been the greatest night of comedy in the history of that crew. Nobody laughed. Jeff sat there and listened with his jaw working, and when I finished, he didn't say a word about any of it. He just reached over and pulled the memory card from my hat camera. Yeah, the camera. Every helmet on that job carried one, whole dive, every dive, for the client's inspection records. Whatever happened down there, it happened in front of a lens the entire time. We watched it in the shack. 8 grown men around one laptop at 3 a.m. The footage shows the silt out, shows it clear, shows my light swinging as the water opens back up, shows the caisson wall coming out of the haze. The base of the wall is empty, no kneeling diver, no pelican. My own recorded voice is on the audio, calm as anything, describing to Jeff a man in vintage gear who is not there. My light tracks and holds on bare concrete and empty silt for 10 minutes. The camera sees me swim up to nothing, put my beam on nothing, and hang there with my light shaking on a sealed, painted, welded hatch that never moves. The lights die on schedule. 2 minutes of black with my breathing going ragged in it, and only my breathing, one man's breathing, and no voice at all. The lights return. The hatch on the footage is shut, was always shut. My camera watches me flee from a wall with a rusted door in it, closed, exactly the way it had been closed for 40 years. The whole shack went quiet in a way I'd never heard a dive shack go, and I sat there watching the screen, watching proof, frame after frame of proof, that none of it was there. And I'm going to be honest with you about what that felt like. It didn't feel better. Then we got to the last few seconds. The final stretch of the file is my ascent. My camera pointed mostly at the downline and my own gloves. And right at the end, just before the recording stops, I turn my head, and for about 2 seconds the inside curve of my faceplate catches the floodlight at an angle, and you can see reflections in the glass. You can see the reflection of my cheek, the reflection of my console lights, and behind my head the reflection of a diving mask, an old one, round window, inches behind me, level with my helmet, tilted slightly, the way a head tilts when it's studying something. The glass of it, even in a reflection, even at that size, is not empty and is not full. It's black, and the black is moving. It rode up with me, every stop. Curtis's hand on my harness on one side, and that on the other, all the way to the light. Jeff scrubbed those 2 seconds back and forth maybe 10 times, and nobody in that shack said one single word, and then he closed the laptop and stood up and walked out onto the deck and lit a cigarette, and as far as I know, he has never discussed it since. The client got a report about a lighting failure and an aborted dive. The card, I'm told, went missing. Companies are good at that. The steel stays. The story changes. I finished the hitch. I want that known. I didn't run home the next morning, but I never went back in the water at that platform. Jeff saw to that without me asking. And at the end of that job, I took a topside position with the company, and inside a year I was out of the industry altogether. 11 years, a spotless record, and I ended it on my own 2 feet, in an office with a window. And if you think less of me for that, I'd invite you to spend 2 minutes in the dark at 190 feet, listening to your own voice beg you for something, and then we'll talk. Because that's the piece of it I've never put down. Not the hand in the helmet, not the crawling. The voice. It didn't threaten me. It asked me. In my voice, with my exact wet-edged 3 a.m. voice, it said, "Don't leave me down here." And everything I know about that platform says 3 men got left down there. in a chamber that got filled and sealed and painted over and renamed until the world agreed to forget it. And some nights I lie awake doing the accounting on that sentence. Whether it was a trick, bait in my own voice, the way anglerfish grow their own little lantern, or whether it was simpler than that, whether something down there has been waiting so long, in the dark, in the concrete, that it's forgotten whose voice it ever had, and reaches for the nearest one and puts it on, and asks. I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. I live 400 miles from saltwater now, and I sleep okay, most of the year, but I'll leave you with the part I've never told anybody, and then I'm done with this story for good. The morning after that dive, I stood at the rail at sunrise, looking down at the water, the way you do. And 190 feet under my boots, give or take, was a wall, and a door, and whatever you want to believe about what's behind it. And standing there in the wind, dead sober, wide awake, I felt the pull. That's the only word I have. Not fear. Pull. Some low, quiet tug in the middle of my chest, patient as a beckoning hand, 2 little curls of the fingers, come here. And for about 1 second, standing at that rail, going back down felt less unthinkable than it should have. I stepped back from the rail, and I never stood at it alone again. They say the sea doesn't give up her dead. I used to think that was just something people put on memorial plaques. Now I think it's the other half of a trade. She doesn't give up her dead. And every now and then, when the lights go out, she asks about the living. Tonight we're going back to the 1990s, a time when a videotape could appear with no name, no digital trail, and no way of knowing who had been watching, and when a roll of film could reveal something you were never supposed to see. Our first story begins after closing time at a Blockbuster, when 2 employees discover a tape that doesn't belong to the store, and when they press play, they find footage of themselves. And in the second story, inside a 1-hour photo lab, a technician notices that one customer keeps ordering double prints of strangers, houses, and darkened doorways, until one of the photographs points directly back at him. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. If you like listening on the go or for sleep, you can also follow the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, leaving a rating or review really helps the show. Now, turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and welcome to Scary Stories from the 1990s. The tape wasn't ours. I knew that before I pressed play, because somebody had peeled off the Blockbuster label and stuck it back on crooked. That's the detail I always start with when I tell this story. Which is almost never, because for a long time, the only people who knew the whole thing were me, a girl named Kelly, a detective with the Richardson Police Department, and a man who is still, as far as I know, in a Texas prison. But I'm in my late 40s now. The store has been a mattress outlet, and then a vape shop, and is currently nothing. And last month my daughter asked me why I won't let anything with a return slot face the street at our house. So here it is. All of it, in order, the way it happened in the summer and fall of 1997, when I was 19 years old and the assistant manager of a Blockbuster Video in Richardson, Texas. The store sat in a strip center off Plano Road, close enough to Richardson Square Mall that we caught the movie crowd coming and going, and close enough to Central Expressway that Friday nights ran the whole crew ragged. If you were alive and renting movies in 1997, You know exactly what the inside of that store looked like without me telling you, because every one of them looked the same. Blue carpet with the ticket pattern, yellow shelf tags, new releases running the entire back wall, faced out boxes, 7 copies of everything, the neighborhood favorites section by the door, a wire dump bin of previously viewed tapes for sale at $9.99, the candy racks, the microwave popcorn, the cardboard standee for whatever was coming next month, and behind the counter, out of sight below the register line, the machinery that actually ran the place. 2 industrial tape rewinders, a bin of returns waiting to be checked in, and a 14-inch television with a VCR that we used to test tapes when a customer swore the movie they rented was damaged, and it was never once actually damaged. I'd worked there since the store opened, and I'd been assistant manager since March, which at 19 meant I closed 5 nights a week and got paid $5.85 an hour to be legally responsible for a cash drawer. I was saving for tuition at Richland College and living at home with my mother and my little sister Beth, who was 13 that year. I'm telling you where I lived and who I lived with now, up front, because it matters later, and I want you to already care. The store manager was a man named Wade, mid-30s, who had come over from managing a Chief Auto Parts and ran the store off a clipboard. Wade wasn't a bad guy. I want to be fair to Wade, even after everything, because the way he handled what happened wasn't evil, it was just small. He was a man whose whole professional instinct was that any problem in the building was a customer service problem, and some problems are not customer service problems. And he found that out the same week I did. The closers, my people, were Kelly and Marcus. Kelly was 20, took classes at Richland during the day, and was the fastest check-in person I've ever seen. She could run a stack of returns through the scanner, eyeball each tape for rewind, and rack the rewinder without ever looking down. Marcus was 17, a senior at Berkner High School, funny, 6'3", and worked weekends. Most closing nights it was 2 of us. State-of-the-art crew, 1997. I want to spend a minute on the routine because everything that happened grew out of the routine, and because there are people reading this who never lived it. A video store ran on a loop. Tapes went out, tapes came back, tapes went out again. The front door had a return slot cut into it, steel flap, with a padded bin on the inside, and that slot never stopped. People fed it on their way to work at 6 in the morning. People fed it at 2 a.m. on their way home from wherever. When you were closing alone in a quiet store, the sound of the flap banging and a tape hitting the bin would make you jump every single time. And then you'd laugh at yourself, and that was just the job. You checked the returns in against the account. You looked at the late date, and you had the late fee conversation, which in 1997 was the single most contested transaction in American retail. $3.50 per tape per day. I've been screamed at over $3.50 by men in business suits. I've had a woman throw a copy of The First Wives Club at my chest. None of it meant anything. It was noise, and the loop ran underneath it, out and back, and every tape got rewound and every tape went back on the wall. 2 more pieces of the store you need, and then I'll get to the tape. The first is the mirrors. Our store had 6 convex security mirrors mounted where the walls met the ceiling. The big fisheye kind, angled so that a person standing at the register could see down every aisle without leaving the counter. We had them because our camera system was a lie. There was a camera housing over the door and another over the back corner, and neither one had ever had a working camera in it. The franchise owner had bought the housings and skipped the rest. And Wade told me that with a straight face during my first week. Told me the housings did the psychological work, and the mirrors did the real work. Shrinkage was candy, and Nintendo 64 cartridges mostly. Kids working in pairs, and you learned to read those mirrors without thinking about it. You learned the shape of a person who was shopping, and the shape of a person who was waiting for you to look away. I got good at the mirrors. I didn't know yet that I was in training. The second is the schedule. The week's shift schedule was handwritten on a photocopied grid and taped to the wall of the break room, and a second copy, and this is the one that I think about, was taped facing outward in the little office window behind the counter, where any customer standing at the register could read it if they wanted to. First names and shift times, Monday through Sunday, in Wade's block printing. Nobody thought anything of it. It was 1997. The whole world was taped up facing outward back then, and nobody imagined anything was ever going to read it. The tape came in on a Tuesday night in the middle of July. I know it was a Tuesday because Tuesdays were truck day. New releases came in Tuesday. And that July, every truck was heavy because Ransom had just hit video, and we had a wall of it. Mel Gibson, 40-some copies, and we still had a waiting list. It rented so hard that copies of Ransom barely touched the shelf. They came through the slot, got checked in, got rewound, and went straight back out the door in somebody else's hand. Around 10:30, half an hour before close, Kelly was running the return bin, and I was counting the second drawer, and she made a noise, an irritated little sound, and held a tape up over her shoulder in my direction without turning around. The case was one of ours, a Ransom case, our barcode, our sticker on the spine. The tape inside was not. Every rental tape we owned wore a printed Blockbuster face label with the title and our store number, laminated flat by a machine. The tape in Kelly's hand had a label that had been peeled off something and pressed back down by a human thumb, crooked, with a bubble under one corner, and the label was blank. Not our stock. Somebody's personal tape, a standard T120, the kind sold in 3-packs at Eckerd, and it had come through our slot inside our case, checked out to an account. This happened, by the way. Not often, but it happened. People taped over rentals by accident. People grabbed the wrong tape off the top of their VCR. People returned their own wedding video inside our copy of Twister, and came back the next day white-faced to trade. The procedure was simple, and I could do it in my sleep. Pull the account, note the mix-up, set the personal tape in the lost and found drawer, charge the account for the missing movie unless it turned up. Kelly pulled the account. And that's where the night turned wrong for the first time, in a small way, a paperwork way. The kind of wrong that you notice with the front of your brain, while the back of your brain quietly starts paying a different kind of attention. The account the case was checked out to had returned their copy of Ransom 4 days earlier. Tape and case, complete, checked in by Marcus, rented back out twice since, which meant the case in Kelly's hand was a second case. Same title, our label format, our store number, that didn't exist in our inventory. Somebody hadn't accidentally returned the wrong tape. Somebody had manufactured one of our cases, or duplicated our spine sticker closely enough to pass in a padded bin at night, put their own tape inside it, and fed it through the slot on purpose, addressed in effect to whoever opened it. I didn't assemble all of that on the spot. On the spot, Kelly and I stood there turning the case over under the counter light, saying the kinds of things you say. That's weird, that's so weird. And I made the decision that 19-year-old assistant managers make, which is that a mystery tape at 10:45 on a Tuesday was a problem for the test VCR. We locked the front door at 11. I killed the outside sign, left the security lights on over the floor, and while Kelly ran the vacuum, I put the tape in the little VCR behind the counter and pressed play, and the 14-inch screen flickered and settled, and I was looking at our own parking lot. I need to describe the footage carefully, because I watched it 3 times that week. Once that night, once with Wade, once with the police. And it's the most completely memorized piece of video in my life, and I've never seen a single frame of it since 1997, and I never want to. It opened mid-shot. No titles, no leader. The way home camcorder footage always opened. Handheld, but braced against something. A car window frame. We'd figure out later. So the image breathed a little without wandering. It was our lot at night, filmed from the far row of parking out by Plano Road. Maybe 150 feet from the storefront. You could read the glow of the sign. You could see the whole front of the store, the poster windows, the door with the return slot, and the pool of light the entrance threw across the sidewalk. For the first while, nothing happened, and my honest first reaction was relief. Somebody had gotten a camcorder for Christmas and burned tape learning the zoom, filming whatever was out the windshield, and our sign was bright, and that was the whole story. The zoom went in and out. It found a shopping cart. It found the marquee letters, Amateur Hour. Then the timestamp in the corner clicked over past midnight, and the front door of the store opened, and two people came out, and the camera stopped wandering. It was me and Marcus. There's no describing what it does to you, watching yourself on a stranger's tape. I knew the night even. Marcus had a rolled-up poster under his arm, a Space Jam standee poster I'd let him take home when the promotion ended, which dated it to late June, roughly 3 weeks before the tape came through the slot. On the screen, 3 weeks in the past, Marcus and I stood on the sidewalk while I locked the door, and we talked about something. And he laughed, and we walked to our cars, and the Zoom followed me. Not Marcus. Me to my Corolla, and it held on the Corolla until my headlights came on and I pulled out onto Plano Road, and then the image cut. The footage jumped, and it was the lot again, different night. Rain on the windshield in this one. The timestamp was 4 days later, closing again. This time it was me and Kelly, and the camera found Kelly the moment the door opened and stayed on her, out across the lot, into her Civic, and held on the Civic's taillights all the way to the exit. The tape ran 40 or 50 minutes, and it was all of that. Night after night, cut after cut, spread across most of a month by the timestamps. Our closings mostly, but a few daytime shots too. Wade carrying the deposit bag to his truck at 10 in the morning. Marcus on his break eating a Whataburger on the curb. Whoever held the camera had learned our shifts. I understood that while it was still playing, standing behind my own counter with the vacuum roaring somewhere behind me in the dark store, because the pattern was right there in the timestamps. He was never filming on nights I'd have called slow. He knew when we closed heavy and when we closed light. He had our rhythm, the store's whole loop, out and back, and he'd gotten it the same place I'd gotten it, by showing up, over and over, and paying attention. And then the last section started, and everything before it stopped mattering. The camera wasn't at our store anymore. It was across a different, smaller parking lot, in daylight, late daylight, filming the front of an apartment complex. 2-story, tan brick, exterior stairs, the kind that lined every street off Spring Valley Road in those days. A young woman came into frame carrying a plastic Blockbuster bag, our bag, and walked toward the stairs. I knew her, not her name. The police pulled her name off our membership records later, and I'm not going to use it here. I'll call her Carrie, which is close. But I knew her the way you know a regular. She rented 2 or 3 nights a week, always came in alone, always right before close, chatty in a tired way, worked some kind of temp job she'd complained to Kelly about. Neighborhood favorites, and romantic comedies. She'd been in so often that spring that Kelly used to have her account pulled up before she reached the counter, and she'd stopped coming. I hadn't consciously noticed until I saw her on that screen, and then I noticed all at once, cold. I hadn't seen Carrie in weeks. On the tape, Carrie crossed the lot with her rental in the bag, and the camera came out from behind whatever it had been braced on, and the image went loose and low and moving, walking motion, the frame swinging with somebody's stride. And it was following her, closing on her. And she reached the bottom of the stairs, and a shoulder in a light-colored shirt came into the left edge of the frame. The cameraman's own shoulder, that close now. And then the camera swung down and away, filming asphalt, filming feet, and the audio. The tape had audio. Tinny little camcorder audio that had been nothing but wind and traffic for 40 minutes. The audio caught a short high sound and a scuffle of shoes on grit and one heavy soft impact, and then nothing. The camera had been set down on something. A car hood, the police thought later, based on the angle. It sat there, level and patient, recording the corner of the building and an empty parking space for 6 more minutes. Nobody crossed the frame. A door closed somewhere off screen. At one point, far off, a car engine started and faded. The empty space sat in the frame, and the timestamp counted. And I stood behind the counter of a locked video store at midnight and watched 6 minutes of nothing with my hand pressed flat over my mouth. And then the tape ran out of recording and dropped to blue screen, and the VCR's auto rewind kicked in with a clunk that made me jump harder than anything on the tape had. And behind me the vacuum shut off. And Kelly said my name, and I don't remember what I said back. I remember what we did though. We did it right, and I'm still proud of us. We didn't rewatch it. We didn't call anybody's house at midnight. Kelly wrote down everything we could pin. The timestamps, the apartment complex's look, Carrie's regular customer status, on the back of a returns report while it was fresh, and I ejected the tape with a pen through the label hole so I wouldn't put more fingerprints on it than I already had, which is a thing I knew to do from a decade of renting cop movies. And we put it in the office safe with the deposit, and I called Wade at home, and at 8 the next morning I called the Richardson Police Department. A detective came out that afternoon. His name was Del Rio, 40s, quiet, drank the break room coffee without complaining about it. He watched the tape twice in the office with the door shut, and when he came out his face had the carefully blank look that I now understand police wear when a thing is bad and thin at the same time. Because it was thin. He walked me through the thinness himself, at the counter, in a low voice, and I'll compress it. There was no crime on the tape. There was the strong shape of a crime. A followed woman, an off-screen struggle, 6 minutes of empty asphalt. But no face, no plate, no name, and no victim. He'd have someone identify the complex from the footage and knock on doors. He asked for whatever we had on the regular customer who matched the woman, and we pulled Carrie's account. Her rentals had stopped cold on a Tuesday 5 weeks earlier, mid-membership. 3 tapes returned on time, and then silence, and the phone number on the account rang to a disconnected line. That put weight on it. But, and he was straight with me, which I appreciated later even though I hated it at the time. A single woman letting an apartment go and moving on with no forwarding was, in his words, most of the missing person calls he ever took. And none of the district's open cases matched her, because nobody had ever reported her missing. Same song as the tape. The strong shape of something, and nothing you could book. He took the tape, the manufactured case, and our lost and found log. And he gave me a card, and he told me to call if the account holder came in, or if anybody came asking about a lost tape. He said that last part looking at me steadily, and I understood that Detective Del Rio had already worked out the thing I'd only half worked out, which is that the tape hadn't come through our slot by mistake, and mistakes were therefore not what we should be waiting for. Wade's reaction was Wade. He was rattled. He'd watched it, and it got to him. But by the next staff meeting the rattled had set into management. He gathered the closers in the break room and told us the matter was with the police. That it wasn't to be discussed with customers or with anyone outside the store. That the company didn't need a Channel 8 situation, and that if anybody asked, nothing had happened. He wrote, "Nothing happened" on the whiteboard and underlined it. I want you to hold on to that image, because for the next 2 weeks, that was the store's official position. And it meant that when the man finally walked in, the only people who knew enough to be afraid of him were me and Kelly, and the only instruction we'd been given was to smile. He came in on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days after Del Rio took the tape, at about 4 o'clock, which I later decided was chosen, early enough that the store was quiet, late enough that the schedule taped in the office window told him I'd be there, because Thursday was one of my doubles, and the whole world could read our schedule. I was alone at the counter. Kelly was in at 5. The man came through the door and didn't browse. That's the first thing I registered about him, before his face, before anything. He came through the door on a line, straight at the counter, and nobody came at the counter on a line except returns and complaints, and his hands were empty. Middle-aged, soft, maybe 50, glasses with a light tint to them, a striped golf shirt tucked into pleated khakis, tucked tight, belt cinched, thinning hair combed with real attention. He was sweating, which meant nothing in a Dallas July, except that our air conditioning ran hard enough that customers complained, and the sweat didn't stop. Everything about him said harmless, and I want to be honest about the fact that if he'd walked in a month earlier, harmless is all I would have seen. A dad. A guy who'd argue a late fee politely and pay it anyway. The whole costume worked. He said he had an embarrassing problem. Those words. He'd returned a tape by accident, a personal tape, home movies, family stuff, irreplaceable, and he was hoping we still had it. And then, Without my asking a single question, he answered all of them. And this is the moment my scalp actually moved, standing at that register. He said it would have come through the overnight slot the previous Tuesday, the 14th. He said it would have been inside a case for ransom. And he said, smiling, apologetic, dabbing his lip with one knuckle, that whoever closed that night would probably remember it. And hadn't that been the tall kid and the young lady? Or was that the night both of you were... He caught himself there. He let the sentence die and reshaped it into something about how he was terrible with faces, but it had come out before the sentence died. Both of you. He knew the tape hadn't been found by the tall kid and the young lady. He knew it had been found by two closers on Tuesday the 14th, and he was standing at my counter watching my face while he said it, and the tint in his glasses was light enough that I could see his eyes doing something entirely different from what his mouth was doing. His mouth was embarrassed. His eyes were checking in on his tape. The tape was out working, and he'd come by to see what it had caught. Here is where I told the lie, and I've run this moment back 10,000 times, and I still don't fully know where it came from, except that some very old part of the brain took over. I made my face do bored. Retail board, late fee board, the face I made 40 times a shift. And I told him, yeah, that rang a bell, a blank tape in a rental case, no label. I told him the policy on found tapes with no name was they went in the recycler bin, that we bulk erased and resold as previously viewed blanks, and that Tuesday's bin had already been run. I told him I was sorry. I offered him a coupon. I've thought a lot about why he believed it, and I think the honest answer is that the store backed my lie. He had spent weeks studying our routine, a loop that took tapes in and processed them and pushed them back out. And I just described that loop eating his tape, and it was exactly what the store he'd been watching would do. He stood there a moment with his tongue touching his upper lip, doing the same math on my face that I was refusing to show him, and then he thanked me, and took the coupon, and walked out on the same straight line he'd walked in on. The second the door closed, I got the plate, or I tried to. I came around the counter fast and stood at the poster window, and his car was backed into a spot in the far row. Backed in, nose out by Plano Road, in the exact patch of the lot the footage had been shot from, and he crossed to it at a walk that was almost a jog, and the plate was against the hedge, and I never saw it. Beige sedan, a Cutlass Sierra, or something in that family, brown pinstripe. I wrote all of it on a returns report, along with every word of the conversation while it still rang, and I called the number on Del Rio's card, and then I called Wade, in that order, and I want that on the record, in that order. Del Rio came out that evening and took me through it twice. The detail that sat him back in his chair was the date and the case title. Those had never gone past the police, Wade, Kelly, and me. When I got to my lie about the bulk eraser, he stopped writing and looked at me for a second, and said that was quick thinking, and then said quietly that it also meant something I needed to hear plainly. As far as that man now knew, the only living record of what was on that tape was the memory of the employees who'd watched it. He asked me who'd closed on the 14th. He wrote Kelly's name and mine, and drew a box around them, and I watched him do it. Wade's response was to ask whether the man had been rude to me. I wish I could tell you the police swept in behind that, but the next 3 weeks were the slow part, the grinding part, and everything happened in inches. Del Rio worked it. I know he did, because he called the store with follow-ups. The apartment complex from the footage had been identified off Spring Valley, and a unit there had been let go by a young woman matching Carrie in early June, rent abandoned, no forwarding. Her temp agency had marked her a no-show the same week. She now existed as a person of concern with no family anyone could locate fast, which meant it all still hung in that gray zone where a grown woman is allowed to vanish on purpose. The beige sedan in my description matched nothing usable. The manufactured case had been wiped clean, and our own prints were all over the tape. He told me they'd stepped up patrol passes on the shopping center at close. I did start seeing the cruiser some nights, sliding through the lot around 11, some nights. And in those same 3 weeks, the man closed in on me by inches, and I can lay the inches out in order. First it was the phone, Store phone, evenings, starting maybe 5 days after the counter conversation. The voice was his, soft, apologetic, unhurried, and the calls weren't thing. That was the genius of them. Is this the Blockbuster on Plano Road? What time do you close tonight? Do you have ransom in? And then, folded into the middle, every time, is the assistant manager working tonight? The young man, I don't recall his name. The first time, Marcus answered and told him my schedule for the week because a customer asked and that was the job. After that, I briefed the crew. Nobody's schedule goes out over the phone. Take a name and number. The man never left one. Kelly noticed the background before I did. The calls had traffic in them, wind on the mouthpiece, sometimes the bong of a passing car over a driveway hose. Payphones. Different ones. There was a payphone bank outside the Tom Thumb up Plano Road and another at the Texaco by the highway. And to this day, I can't walk past the ghost of where a payphone used to be without hearing that voice asking what time we closed. Then it was closing time itself. He stopped coming inside, never came inside again, in fact, not once after the coupon. But he began to be adjacent at 11 o'clock. The beige sedan, nose out, far row, twice in 1 week. Once across the street entirely, in the mall's satellite lot, which I only spotted because I'd started standing at the poster window with the lights off before walking out, studying the dark lot through the glass, a 19-year-old learning counter-surveillance out of pure animal need. I called the patrol number both times. Both times the lot was empty by the time the cruiser swung through. He knew their rhythm too. Of course he did. Rhythm was the whole thing he was. I stopped letting Kelly walk out alone. We left in a pair every night. Engines started in a pair, and she followed my car to the light at Beltline before we split. And we never talked about the fact that we'd invented a procedure. We just did it, the way you put your seatbelt on. And then, on a Tuesday in the middle of August, Tuesdays again, I think the day was part of his joke, the flap on the return slot banged at some dead hour of the night, and when Marcus ran the morning bin, there was a second personal tape in it. No rental case at all this time. No pretense of a mix-up. A bare T120 with a peeled, restuck blank label, crooked, with a bubble under one corner, sitting in the padded bin on top of somebody's copy of Jerry Maguire. Marcus, God bless him, followed the new procedure and didn't touch it past gloves. He called me. I called Del Rio, and this time I didn't press play. The police watched it first, and Del Rio brought it back to the store that evening and sat me down in the office and told me what was on it, in a voice I hadn't heard him use before. And then, because I insisted, and I did have to insist, he let me see enough of it to confirm what he needed confirmed. It was my street. It was my mother's house, filmed in morning light from a parked car's window. The brick, the live oak, my Corolla in the driveway with the sun coming up behind it. It was our garbage cans out on a Thursday, which is trash day on my street, which meant more than one morning. And it was the corner 2 houses down, where the RISD bus stopped at 7:40 a.m., and it was a small knot of middle schoolers with backpacks, and the Zoom went in, past the other kids, past all of them, and found my sister, and held Beth. 13 years old, backpack on both shoulders, holding a folder against her chest, waiting for the bus, on a stranger's tape, in a store's back office, in a detective's hands. The tape ran 4 minutes and it said one thing. It was an answer to my lie, mailed through the same slot the lie had been built to protect. I'd told him the machine ate his tape and nothing came of it. And here was his reply, patient and unsigned. I know it didn't. I know you watched it. I know where you sleep. I know who you love. And I know what time the bus comes. Del Rio put a car on my street the next morning, and the morning after that, and Beth got walked to the bus stop by our mother for reasons my mother was only half told, and I aged about a decade in a week. And I want to mark this point in the story clearly, because everything to here had happened to the store, to the routine, to the crew. This was the moment it became mine. Whatever he'd done to Carrie had started exactly this way, with him, unseen, learning the rhythm of a life. and I was now somewhere in the middle of that same process, and the only two facts in my favor were that I knew it was happening, and that he didn't know I knew he'd told me so himself, at a counter in a striped golf shirt. Or was that the night both of you, two closers? He'd known, that first Thursday, exactly who had seen his work. And in the second week of September, on a night when the schedule in the office window said the two names he had a box drawn around in his own head were closing together, he came to collect us both. But before I tell you about that night, I have to tell you about the 3 weeks in front of it, because the 3 weeks were their own kind of bad. And skipping them would make this sound faster and cleaner than it was. Nothing about it was fast or clean. It was 20-some days of an ordinary life with something wrong running underneath it. And I've come to believe that's the true shape of these stories. Not the night everything happens, but the long stretch where you carry it around while the rest of the world rents movies. At home it was lies of omission, approved lies, and I hated every one of them. Del Rio had sat with my mother once, early, and given her the sanded-down version. An unstable customer had fixated on the store. There had been some concerning behavior. Patrols were watching the street as a precaution. All true. All missing the tape of her daughter at the bus stop, which he and I had agreed, in the office, that she didn't need in her head while it was being handled. And I signed off on that, 19 years old, deciding what my own mother could carry, and I still don't know if it was right. So my mother walked Beth to the corner every morning under the polite fiction of new neighborhood caution, and Beth complained about it the way 13-year-olds complain, loudly at breakfast. And I sat there eating cereal with the actual footage running behind my eyes, and I learned that you can hold a spoon steady while doing that. It's a skill. I've never been proud of having it. I did my own counter work too, because sitting still had stopped being possible. Our membership system could pull account histories, and I spent 2 closes going through it with Kelly. Every mail account with rental activity that dropped off or went strange around mid-July. Every account opened in the last year with daytime-only rentals, anything. It was a haystack with no needle. Our store carried over 11,000 member accounts. The fields were name, address, phone, and drive-off history, and nothing in a 1997 video store database was built to answer the question, who here is watching us? We found nothing. I learned after the arrest that his account was 9 rentals in 2 years. All daytime, all on time. A file so quiet no search I could invent would ever have surfaced it. He was in our own records the entire time, filed under clean. I think about that more than almost any other part of this. Then there was the evening at the Tom Thumb, which I've never been able to prove was anything, and which I'm certain to my bones was something. First week of September, a Wednesday, my night off. My mother needed milk and I drove up Plano Road at around 9, and the payphone bank stood outside the store's entrance, 3 phones under one steel canopy, and as I walked from my car, a man was standing at the middle phone with his back to me. Pleated khakis, soft build, thinning hair under the sodium light, and I stopped walking in the middle of the parking lot. Just stopped, between a cart corral and somebody's minivan. And as I stood there, the man hung up and didn't turn around and walked away from me down the front of the store and around the corner past the ice machine, unhurried, and was gone. I never saw his face. I stood at that cart corral for a minute, and then I went to the middle phone and put my hand on the receiver, and the receiver was warm, and I called the store from it, from that exact phone, and Marcus answered, and I asked him, my voice doing its best impression of bored, whether anybody had just called. He said, yeah, actually, a minute ago. Some guy asking if I was working tonight. He told him no, night off. I drove home the long way, watching my mirrors the whole time, and I didn't buy the milk, and I've never told my mother why there was no milk, and if she ever reads this, that's why, Mom. That's why there was no milk. The last thing from those weeks is the schedule, and I want it on the record because it's the one fight I lost that mattered. After the Beth tape, I asked Wade to take the shift schedule out of the office window, the outward-facing copy, the one any customer could read. I laid out the reasoning in one sentence. The man knew our shifts, and this was where our shifts were printed. Wade heard me out, and then he explained, not unkindly, that the window schedule was how the whole crew checked their hours, that moving it would confuse everybody, and that we shouldn't reorganize the store around one weirdo. He said the police had it handled. He said, and he tapped the whiteboard when he said it, that the main thing was that we all stayed calm and professional. So the schedule stayed in the window, facing out, in Wade's block printing, first names and shift times, Monday through Sunday. And in the second week of September it said, for Thursday, in letters a man in the parking lot could have read through binoculars and photocopied at his leisure. And did. The trunk inventory proved he did. 2 names, 10 to close. Mine and Kelly's. It was Thursday, September 18th, 1997. And I can tell you the date without looking anything up because it's on the arrest report. And I've read the arrest report more times than I've read anything else ever printed. It was me and Kelly, 10 to close. An ordinary hard Thursday. New release turnover. A birthday party's worth of kids in the Nintendo aisle at 8. A man who wanted to fight about a rewind fee on Star Trek First Contact at 9. Marcus had asked off for a football game. Wade had left at 6. By 10:15 the store had gone into its late shift shape, 3 or 4 browsers drifting the aisles, the ceiling speakers playing the promo loop, Kelly running returns, me facing the new release wall, which means walking the back wall pulling every box flush to the shelf edge, a job I'd done so many thousands of times that I could do it in the dark. Hold that thought. I didn't know it at 10:40. What happened at 10:40 is that the phone rang once, a half ring, chopped off, and Kelly picked it up and got nothing and hung up, and we traded a look, because the payphone calls had trained us both to hate the phone. And then a customer needed her, and the moment passed. At 10:55 I called our own second line from the register phone to check the time clock modem, a nightly chore, and the line was dead. Both lines. No dial tone, no static, nothing. Dead plastic against my ear, and I stood there holding it and looking out the poster windows at the parking lot, and the parking lot looked different. The way an ordinary place looks when one new piece of information has just changed every single thing it contains. I know now, from the report, what had happened outside. The phone line came down the strip center's rear wall to a junction box by our stockroom door, and it had been cut, cleanly, along with the line to the empty suite next door. He'd either not known which was ours, or not cared. What I knew that night was less and worse. The calls had always been him checking whether I was working. Tonight nobody had checked, and now the phone was dead. It didn't take detective work. It took subtraction. Here's what I want you to understand about the next 20 minutes, though. The last 20 minutes we were open. Nothing happened. That's what a real siege is. The movies get it wrong. Customers checked out. I smiled, ran cards through the knuckle buster when the deadline killed the card machine, and blamed the phone company out loud, laughing, while my eyes went to the mirrors between every sentence. Kelly caught it off my face inside a minute. She asked me nothing in front of customers, just moved to the counter and stayed inside arm's reach of the silent alarm button, which lived on a bracket under the register lip, wired straight to the alarm company on its own cellular box. The one piece of the store's security that wasn't a lie, and which Wade had shown me exactly once, in March, saying we'd never need it because the housings over the door did the psychological work. At 11, I walked the last 2 browsers out, a couple renting Fools Rush In, and I've wondered for 28 years whether they ever knew what store they were standing in. And I locked the front door behind them, and threw the top bolt, and killed the sign. Store policy after lockup was written down somewhere, and it was this: 1 closer runs the drawer counts, 1 walks the floor, straightening, pulling stray tapes, checking the restroom and the stock room, then lights out, alarm on, out the front in a pair. The floor walk took 10 minutes, and I'd done it over 1,000 times, and until that September I'd never once thought of it as searching the building. That night I stood at the counter with the keys in my fist, and looked down the length of the store, at the aisles I knew by heart, the head-high rows of action and comedy and drama running away from me under the security lights, 40 feet of shelving you couldn't see over or through, and above them the 6 fisheye mirrors holding their 6 warped little copies of the room. And I did the math I should have done at 10:40. I'd watched the door all night, but the door had been unlocked for 13 hours, and I hadn't watched it for 13 hours, and a man whose entire art was rhythm, who knew our promo loop, our slow hours, our floor walk pattern, what time the last browser left, which of us counted the drawer, didn't have to come in at the end of the night at all. I never said any of this out loud. What I said was Kelly's name, once, quietly, and she looked at me, and I looked down the store, and that was the entire conversation. She put her hand flat on the counter 3 inches from the alarm bracket. And because the button had to be held for a 2 count, and because we didn't actually know anything yet, and because 2 teenagers who set off a silent panic alarm over a dead phone line were going to have a very Wade morning ahead of them. I'm being honest about every factor that was in my head. I did the floor walk. I took it slow and I took it wrong on purpose, and that's what saved it. The routine walk ran the aisles in order, 1 through 6, front of the store to the back. Instead, I walked the front cross aisle along the registers, where the ceiling mirrors could work for me, reading each aisle's mirror before I passed its mouth. Mirror 1, empty aisle. Mirror 2, empty. The store hummed. The promo loop had shut off with the sign, and the only sounds were the air conditioning and Kelly turning the drawer's quarters, which she was doing steadily, evenly, on purpose, so the store would sound the way the store was supposed to sound. The 5th mirror was family and kids, and in the warped little circle of it, low, at the far dark end of the aisle where Disney met the back wall, between the shelf line and the floor, there was a shape that the shelf shouldn't have had, a pale curve, hip-high, motionless. A person's shoulder, in a light-colored shirt, belonging to somebody crouched at the end cap with their back against the wall of tapes. Somebody who had walked into aisle 5 as a browser at some point in the ordinary evening, and sat down in the blind spot where the shelving met the stockroom corner, 30 feet from 2 teenagers counting money, and waited for the lights to start going out. He had made one mistake in an otherwise very careful evening, and it's the reason I'm typing this. He'd learned the store from a parking lot. From 150 feet out, through a windshield, our aisles red as solid walls and the mirrors red as dots on the ceiling line. He'd mapped every rhythm the store had, but he'd never worked a shift under those mirrors, never learned that from the front cross aisle, the 5th mirror sees the Disney end cap. The store he'd studied for a month had one more angle than he knew about, and it was showing me his shoulder. I didn't stop walking. That's the part I still don't know where I found. I read the shape in the mirror in one stride and kept moving at floor walk speed, past the mouth of 5 without turning my head, and at the mouth of 6 I said in my checking the restroom voice, loud enough to carry, that the restroom light was out again and I'd grab the stepladder, store noise, nothing noise. And I came back up the far side along the poster windows toward the counter, and Kelly read my face at 40 feet, the way she read a barcode, and her hand slid the 3 inches, and she pressed the button, and held it, 1, 2, before I'd covered half the distance, and nothing in the store changed at all. No siren, no light. The alarm was a cellular whisper to a company in another city, and the store hummed on, and somewhere behind me in aisle 5, a patient man crouched in the dark, 30 feet away, not knowing the police were already rolling. The dispatch log says the alarm company received the panic signal at 11:18, and Richardson PD logged the call at 11:19, and the first unit, which had been running the stepped-up passes Del Rio had set weeks before, and was 4 blocks up Plano Road at a gas station, marked arrival at 11:22. 4 minutes. I've lived whole years shorter than those 4 minutes, because at 11:20 he stood up. I think he'd heard the wrongness by then. The floor walk that never finished. 2 closers now, both behind the counter, the lights that weren't going out on schedule. Kelly saw him first, in the mirrors, the pale shirt rising up out of family and kids at the far end of the store, and there was no crouch about him anymore, and no browsing, and no costume. He came up the length of aisle 5 at a fast, flat walk, one hand down at his side holding something short and dark that the arrest report would inventory as a stun gun, and the other hand carrying a folded pair of ratchet tie-down straps. And he wasn't coming at the front door. He was coming at the gap in the counter, the swing-through by the rewinders, the entrance to the employee area, to the office, to the safe, to the 2 names in the box. And I'd love to tell you I did something from a movie, but what I did was throw the bolt on the counter gate and put my back against it with the register between me and the gap, and Kelly stood on the button she no longer needed to hold and screamed the store's address into the dead phone anyway, on pure adrenaline. And the man reached the counter gate and put his weight into it, twice, close enough that the gate jumped against my spine, close enough that I could hear him breathing through his nose, fast and even, workmanlike, a man dealing with a stuck drawer, and the parking lot outside went red and blue. He stopped pushing the instant the light changed. That efficiency is the thing my body remembers most. No panic, no freeze. The weight just left the gate, and he turned and went away from the light, down the back cross aisle at a run, through the swinging door into the stockroom, where the rear delivery door had a panic bar and opened onto the alley behind the strip center, and where the second unit, following the protocol Del Rio had written for this address after the Beth tape, was already parked in the alley with its lights off. He came through the panic bar at a dead run with a stun gun in his hand, into the alley, into the takedown, and the report says he was proned out and cuffed at 11:26, and it says he made no statement, and it says the arresting officer noted that the subject, once cuffed, stopped resisting entirely and asked one question, which was whether the store's tapes got erased before resale. Even face down in an alley, still checking on his tape. The rest I mostly know from Del Rio, the papers, and the trial that never quite happened because he pleaded out in the spring of 1998. His name was Gerald Fisk. He was 51, and he'd rented from our store exactly 9 times over 2 years, always daytime, never late, an account so clean it had never once surfaced. The beige sedan was registered to his late mother's name at an address he hadn't lived at in a decade. In the trunk in the back seat, that night, inventoried, 11 more T120 tapes, a camcorder in a zippered bag, binoculars, a photocopied Blockbuster shift schedule, 3 weeks old, our store, Wade's Block Printing, along with 2 older schedules going back to June, a spiral notebook of times and initials that the prosecutor would later walk the judge through page by page, and in a paper Tom thumbsack, a woman's wallet, a hairbrush, and a set of keys with a Blockbuster membership card on the ring. Carrie's card, our store number on it. They ran Fisk's paper the same night, and his paper had a hole in it. A rent payment, in money orders, on a house in Garland leased under the name Gerald Loomis. Richardson and Garland PD went through the Loomis house at 4 a.m. on September 19th, and in a back bedroom with the windows screwed shut, a hasp and padlock on the outside of the door, and a television with a VCR on a milk crate, they found Carrie, alive, 91 days after the 6 minutes of empty parking space. I'm not going to write anything else about those 91 days, because they belong to her, and she survived them. And the last I ever heard, years ago now in secondhand, she was living out of state and married, and I hope the rest of it to this day. Fisk took a plea in April of 1998. Aggravated kidnapping and unlawful restraint for Carrie, burglary, and the stalking counts for us. And the sentences stacked up past his life expectancy, and the papers gave it 3 days and moved on. Because in 1998 the world was full of news, and a video store was nobody's idea of a crime scene. The store went back to being a store almost insultingly fast. Wade erased the whiteboard. The schedule came out of the office window. I took it down myself the day after, and Wade never said a word about it. Kelly finished her associates and moved to Austin in 1999, and we still talk every September 18th, every year, about nothing, for about 10 minutes, and it's one of the most important phone calls in my life. Marcus is a coach now. I left the store in 2000 for a real job. The store left the world a decade after that, and the 14-inch TV and the little VCR went into a dumpster somewhere, along with the rewinders and the mirrors and all of it. One more thing, and then the ending, which isn't mine. It's from the search inventory, and it's the reason I finally wrote all this down. When the police went through the Loomis house that night, past the padlocked door, they photographed everything, And Del Rio showed me one photograph months later because he said I'd earned the whole picture. It was the living room, an armchair, a TV tray, a rented videotape on top of the VCR in its blue and yellow case, 9 days overdue, our sticker on the spine. The movie he had meant to return was still sitting in his VCR when police searched the house. Every 1-hour photo tech from the 90s will tell you the same thing if you get a couple drinks in them. We looked, all of us, at everything. The machine printed your whole roll right out in the open. 36 4x6 prints of your life sliding down a conveyor into an envelope. And the person running that machine saw every single one. Birthdays, new babies, vacations, girlfriends the wife didn't know about. We saw it. We sleeved it. We handed it across the counter with a smile and said, "That'll be $8.49. Have a great day." I'm telling you that up front so you'll believe the rest of it, because the rest of it only happened for one reason. I looked. In 1994, I was 22, taking what I kept calling a semester off from Wichita State that had quietly turned into 3 semesters, and I worked the photo counter at a 1-hour lab in Town East Square, out on the east side at Kellogg and Rock Road, biggest mall in Kansas. Dillard's on one end, Penny's and Sears holding down the rest, a food court that smelled the same every day of its life, an Orange Julius, a Sam Goody, a Glamour Shots, where women went in normal and came out with feather boas and a soft focus problem. Our lab sat on the main concourse between a Walden Books and a place that sold nothing but airbrushed t-shirts. And we had the big backlit sign every lab had. 1-hour photo, double prints every Tuesday. Hold on to the double prints thing. It matters at the end. The lab itself was one machine and a counter. The machine was a Noritsu mini lab about the size of 2 refrigerators laid sideways, and it did everything. Developed the film in C41 chemistry, scanned the negatives, exposed the paper, ran the prints out a chute at the top where they dropped into a catch tray in order. My job was feeding it, keeping the chemistry in spec, cutting negatives into strips of 4 for the sleeves, and doing color corrections on the fly, because straight out of the machine half of everything printed too cyan or too dense, and a good tech rode the correction buttons frame by frame. I was a good tech, I'll just say that plainly because it's load-bearing. I shot my own stuff on a Pentax K1000 I'd bought used. I'd taken 2 photography classes at WSU before the semester off, and I knew film the way the other counter staff didn't. My manager, Arlene, had been in photo finishing since the photomat kiosk days and could run the machine asleep, but she processed pictures. I read them. There's a difference, and the difference is this whole story. The other regular was Deb, mid-40s, part-time, worked mornings so she could get her kids off the bus in Derby. Deb's contribution to history is that she's the one who took in the first role, and she remembered him, and what she remembered turned out to matter. Now. The job had rhythms. January was dead. Spring break brought the beach rolls. May brought proms and tornado season, sometimes in the same envelope. Every roll of film in Wichita eventually crossed somebody's counter, ours or Walgreens or the Dillon's grocery lab, and after a few months, you'd seen the whole catalog of what people photograph, and I can tell you the catalog is short. People photograph what they love and what they can't believe. That's it. That's the whole list. Although, and I need to give you this, because without it my judgment in this story means nothing, the list has a weird back page, and a working tech saw the back page every week. There were rolls that stopped you cold and turned out to be nothing, and learning that was part of the trade. My first month, I ran a roll that was 24 frames of headstones, different cemeteries, close-ups of the dates, and I about called somebody, and Arlene looked at 2 frames and said genealogy. Retirees did it all the time, she said. Photograph the family graves before the weather takes the carving. She was right. The man who picked it up wore a Korea veteran's cap and tipped me $1. Another time it was a whole roll of one intersection, crumpled cars from 9 angles, skid marks with a tape measure laid beside them, and that one was an insurance adjuster, obviously. and the only thing wrong with me for wondering was that I was new. Wrecks, dead deer, a burned kitchen, a neighbor's fence photographed for a lawsuit, teenagers with somebody's dad's gun posing in a basement. The drawer of almost alarming was deep, and 99 times out of 100, there was a boring adult reason standing right behind the print, holding a clipboard. So understand, I wasn't a jumpy kid looking for a monster in the tray. By March of '94, I'd been trained out of jumpy. I knew the boring reasons. I went looking for the boring reason the way Arlene taught me, every single time. Which is why the first roll stopped me, because it wasn't either one. Envelope G. Sutter, no phone number. 24 exposures, Kodak Gold 200. Prints, 4x6, glossy, double. It came in on a Tuesday in the middle of March. Dropped with Deb in the morning, picked up same day. I ran it around lunch. 24 frames, and I still remember the tray filling up and the feeling of my attention shifting, one frame at a time, from bored to something that didn't have a name yet. Houses, that's all. Houses at dusk, shot from across the street. A tan ranch house with the porch light on. The same ranch house from a different angle. A split level with a basketball hoop over the garage and a Plymouth Voyager in the driveway. The Voyager again, closer, the frame centered not on the van, but on the strip of side yard next to it, where a gate stood open. A 2-story on a corner lot, dusk again, one upstairs window lit. The same window zoomed, the curtain glowing. No people in the first 15 frames. Then frame 16, a woman at a bus stop bench, shot from inside a car. You could see the doorframe edge and a sliver of side mirror intruding on the left of the frame. She was maybe 30, work clothes, a Taco Tico cup beside her on the bench, looking up the street for her bus. Frames 17 through 19, the same woman, same minute, the zoom walking in closer each time. Frame 20, a kid's bike lying on a front lawn. 21, the bike again, and behind it, the front door of the house standing open into a dark hallway. Nobody visible. 22 through 24, the tan ranch house again, full night now, porch light off. I want to be careful here because everything that went wrong with getting anyone to care about this started in this exact spot. So I'll say it the way the police eventually said it to me. There is nothing illegal in the paragraph you just read. You can stand on a public street and photograph a house. You can photograph a stranger at a bus stop. Creepy isn't a crime. I knew that at 22 standing at the catch tray, and I sleeved the negatives and stuffed the envelope and put it in the pickup bin under S. And when a man came for it at 4 o'clock, I wasn't even the one at the register. Arlene handed it across. Cash. I got one look at the back of him leaving. Medium everything, tan jacket, walking unhurried up the concourse past the airbrush shop. And I remember deciding, consciously, the way you decide to let a yellow light go, that it was a real estate guy. Comps. Insurance adjuster. Something with a clipboard attached to it somewhere. Deb told me something about that first drop-off, months later in the break room, after it was all over the news and we were allowed to compare notes. She said he hadn't left. 1 hour service, and most people looped the mall or went to the food court, and he'd gone and sat on the concourse bench across from us, the one by the planter, facing the lab, and stayed the whole hour, not reading, not people watching, or not the way people watch. Sitting with his hands on his knees, watching the counter, watching the machine run, watching her sleeve envelopes, for 60 straight minutes. And when his prints hit the bin, he was standing at the register before she'd called the name. She'd written it off the way we wrote everything off. Some folks are particular about their pictures. What she'd actually watched, we understand now, was a man surveying the lab the same way he surveyed everything, learning our counter the way he learned back doors, who worked it, where the eyes went, what the routine was. We were in the rotation before I ever ran a frame. Except real estate guys don't shoot houses at night, and nothing about a bus stop woman is comps. And he'd ordered doubles. I didn't sleep great that night, and then a week went by and the machine fed me 400 other people's Easter and I mostly forgot. That's the true part nobody likes. I forgot him for a while. You would have too. Envelope. Paul Reese. No phone number. 24 exposures. Kodak Gold, 200. 4x6, glossy, double. Second roll, first week of April. Different name, different handwriting on the envelope. And I'd learn later the handwriting thing was its own piece of work, because he wrote each alias in a different style, slanted for one, printed for another. And he kept them straight, roll after roll for months. Deb took this one in too, and Deb's the one who flagged it, sort of, by accident. She mentioned it at shift change the way you'd mention weather. Another one of those house rolls, she said. Guy gave her the creeps, wouldn't put a phone number on the envelope, said he'd just come back. I ran it personally. More houses. A new neighborhood this time. I recognized a street sign in frame 9, blue stem, which put it east side, not far from the mall, and that's the first time his photographs attached themselves to real ground I could drive to, because up to then the houses had existed nowhere, the way pictures do. This roll had people. A man in his 50s getting his mail, shot long. A garage interior, shot from the street. Shelves and a deep freeze visible in the dark past a parked Buick. And 6 frames, 6, of the back of a yellow house from what had to be an alley. Back door, back windows, a swing set, a dog run with no dog in it. Here's what I did that I'd never done in a year and a half at that counter. When I cut the negatives, the machine's cutter left me one orphan strip, and instead of sleeving everything into the envelope, I pulled the test print. I should explain test prints, because this is the part of the job nobody knew existed, and it's the reason any of the story ends the way it ends instead of some other way. When the chemistry drifted or the paper lot changed, we ran calibration, and when a frame came through badly exposed, the machine sometimes double-fed, or the tech reprinted with corrections. And the bad copies, the rejects, the tests, the doubles that shouldn't exist, went into a drawer under the counter to be counted against paper inventory at the end of the month and thrown out. Every lab had that drawer. Customers never heard about that drawer. What it meant, practically, was that the lab sometimes kept a frame the customer didn't know had ever been printed. Frame 4 of the Reese roll had come through dense, and I'd reprinted it, and the dark first copy went in the reject drawer, and that was all true and normal, and by the book. What wasn't by the book is that at 9 that night, after close, I ran 2 more frames dark on purpose, called them rejects, and put those in the drawer too. The 6-frame yellow house sequence bothered me that much. I wanted the lab to remember what I'd seen, in a way that didn't depend on me. 22-year-olds don't usually get to be right about the thing they're most afraid they're being dramatic about. I'd trade it back if I could. Envelope, M. Kessler. No phone number. 36 exposures. Kodak Gold, 200. 4x6, glossy, double. Roll 3 came in the last week of April, and Roll 3 is where I stopped wondering whether it was the same man, because Roll 3 is where the film told me. Different alias, 36 exposures this time, dropped at lunch rush with Arlene, and Arlene's description at shift change matched Deb's, matched the tan jacket. Pleasant, forgettable, cash, no phone, I'll just come back. I ran the roll after close with the gate down over the counter and the mall going quiet outside, which in hindsight is a strange choice, developing a stranger's surveillance photography alone at night in an empty mall, but I'd stopped being able to run his stuff with customers around. It felt wrong to run his film around normal people. I didn't want anyone standing at my counter looking at their kid's birthday party while that came down the conveyor. The content had moved. That's the only way to put it. The houses were still there. The yellow house was back, 4 more frames of its rear elevation, and 1 frame shot straight down the alley showing how the yard gates lined up. But half the roll was now people, and the people frames had changed character. The bus stop woman from March was in this roll. Same woman, no question, different day, walking with groceries. The frame after her was her front door. The frame after that was the door again at night. And a new subject, a family. Frames 19 through 28, 1 family, tracked across what the light said was at least 3 different days. A dad mowing. 2 kids on bikes in a cul-de-sac. The mom, and this frame is the one I'd end up describing to police more times than any other. The mom at a Dillon's register, shot from the parking lot through the storefront glass with a long lens. unloading a cart, her head turned to laugh at something the checker said. Somebody had stood in a grocery store parking lot in Wichita, Kansas, in the spring of 1994, and photographed a woman laughing inside, and then driven that film to my mall and paid $3.99 plus tax for me to make him 2 copies of it. But I said the film told me it was one man, so let me pay that off, because this is my favorite part of the story, and the only way any of this can have a favorite part. Every camera has a film gate, the rectangular frame the film sits behind when the shutter opens. If the gate has a burr on it, a tiny nick in the metal, from a drop, from grit, from the factory, it scratches the emulsion the same way on every single frame that camera ever takes. On prints it can show as a fine line, but on the negatives it's unmistakable. A hairline running the frame's length, identical spacing, identical depth, roll after roll. That's a real thing, by the way. Labs knew it, and police knew it. A camera with a bird gate marks every roll it ever shoots, identically, in a place no other camera will ever quite match. The Kessler negatives had a hairline scratch, top third of the frame, running edge to edge. I pulled my orphan reject strips from the Sutter and Reese rolls out of the drawer, put all 3 under the loop on the light panel, and there it was. All 3 rolls, same line, same position, measured against the sprocket holes with the little metric ruler I used for cutting. 3 names, 3 handwritings, 1 camera. I photographed the strips lined up on the light panel with my own Pentax, and I wrote out everything I knew on a legal pad. Dates, aliases, contents, the scratch, and I started what I can only call a file, which lived in my locker in the back next to my Discman, and a paperback of the client I never finished. It's still strange to me how calm the file made me feel. As long as it was a puzzle, it stayed a puzzle. Puzzles don't drive to your street. 2 things happened in May, and I'll take them in order. The first is that I tried the police round 1, and it went exactly how you think. I called the non-emergency line for the Wichita Police Department on my day off, and did my best, and my best sounded insane out loud, and I knew it while I was saying it. A man is taking photographs. Of what, sir? Houses. Whose houses? I don't know. Has he threatened anyone? No. Has he trespassed? Not that I can see. Sir, is there a crime you're calling to report? And there wasn't. The officer wasn't rude. He took my name, and he said the sentence I'd already said to myself in March, the one about how photography from a public street isn't a crime. And he suggested that if the customer made staff uncomfortable, the store could refuse him service. Refuse him service. I want to frame that. The one lever anybody could offer me was the power to make him get his double prints at Walgreens, where nobody was keeping reject strips in a drawer. I said thank you and hung up and went back to the file. If the lab was the only place paying attention, the lab needed to keep him. That's a heavy thing to decide at 22, and I didn't so much decide it as fail to undecide it, week after week. The second thing that happened in May is the yellow house. I'd gotten good at placing his neighborhoods by then. Street signs when he was sloppy, but mostly it was edges. Water towers, the grain elevator horizon lines, a Brahms sign in deep background. Once a church marquee I matched by driving. On my days off, I'd started doing something I never told Arlene about. I drove his frames. I'd pick a location I'd pinned and drive past it once, not stopping, just confirming the real world matched the prints. The yellow house took me 2 Sundays to find, and it was real. Of course it was real. On a quiet street off Lincoln east of Rock Road, swing set in back, dog run with no dog. I drove past at 15 miles an hour with my heart going and a WSU ball cap pulled low, which tells you something about where my head already was. I was disguising myself from him without ever having seen his face. I'd caught it. The way of thinking. It comes through the prints, if you handle enough of them. You start seeing houses as sides and gates and sightlines. I hated it. I kept doing it. I found the bus stop too, and I'm going to tell about the bus stop even though nothing happens in this part, because it's the half hour that changed what the file meant to me. It was a Metropolitan Transit bench on East Harry, in front of a strip of storefronts, a laundromat and a tax place, and a Taco Tico 2 doors down, which explained the cup. I parked a block off and walked it, sat on the bench, and from the bench I did the thing I'd gotten infected with, which is that I looked back the other way, along the line his lens must have run, and found the spot, had to be, angles don't lie. A diagonal parking slot across and slightly east, in front of the laundromat, where a car could sit facing her with the sun behind it for an entire afternoon and be the single most invisible object in Kansas. There were 3 cars parked in that row while I sat there. A woman came and waited for the bus 4 feet from me, holding a toddler's hand, and I got up and left, because I'd realized I was a stranger studying sightlines at her bus stop, and the difference between me and him had gotten thin enough to feel, and it scared me more than any print had. I found the yellow house in the 3rd week of May. On the morning of June 6th, a Monday, the yellow house was in the Wichita Eagle, not a big story. Metro section, 3 paragraphs, 1 photo, a police photo, daylight. The back door I'd seen 6 times in another man's negatives, now with a sheriff's deputy standing beside it. A family on the east side had woken on Saturday to find their house had been entered overnight while all 4 of them slept. Nothing of value missing. That's what made it news at all, the strangeness. The pried back door and the things moved. Kitchen chairs turned, a photo album out on the table. The story used the word burglary because there wasn't a better word in the paper's kit, and it said police were looking into whether it connected to 2 similar incidents in the spring, both east side, both entries at night while residents were home, both with nothing much taken. I stood at our kitchenette counter in my apartment with the Metro section flat in front of me, and the reject strip from the Reese roll in my other hand, and I don't remember deciding anything. I remember being in the car. I will say this for the Wichita Police Department. The second conversation was different, because the second conversation started with me putting photographs of the victim's back door on a detective's desk, developed from film that had crossed my counter 5 weeks before the crime, wearing a date in the negative numbering, matched by a physical camera scratch to 2 other rolls full of other houses. That's not a creepy customer anymore. That's somebody's shopping list with receipts. The detective's name was Brandt, Crimes Against Persons, a heavy-set man in his 50s with reading glasses he wore on a cord, and a way of going very still while he listened that I came to rely on. He kept me 2 hours. He took the file, the strips, my legal pad, my Pentax shots of the light panel. He confirmed, carefully, in cop grammar, that the 3 spring incidents were real, unsolved, and worse in person than in the paper. Worse in a way he wouldn't detail then, and I only learned fully at trial, and all I'll say here is that in one of the houses, the moved objects had been moved in the bedrooms, while the family slept. He asked whether the man had ever photographed the same location after an incident, and I said I didn't know, and he nodded and made a note, and I understood the question a week later, when I finally did, and wished I hadn't. Because that's the thing Brandt already suspected, and I hadn't let myself line up. The rolls weren't all shopping list. Some frames, we'd eventually confirm, were after. He went back. He photographed what he'd already done, from the street, in daylight. The porch light off, the house sitting there not knowing. And he ordered doubles of that too. The summer of 1994 was a strange season to be living inside a secret. The whole country spent that summer looking at one thing. I stood in the electronics section at Sears on June 17th with about 40 strangers watching a white Bronco drive slow on every TV on the wall. Everybody quiet, everybody's ice cream melting. And I remember thinking that I was doing the same thing as the helicopter cameras, in miniature, in a mall in Kansas. Watching a man through a lens he didn't control, waiting to find out what he was. Because that's what June and July became, waiting, run on rules. Brandt built the rules, and I worked them. He made me repeat back to him in his office until I could say them cold. Rule 1, the lab ran normal. Nobody got told. Not Arlene, not Deb, not corporate, nobody. Because the single most valuable thing in the case was a man who believed his photo lab was a machine with no memory. Brandt handled it over my head somehow, some quiet arrangement above Arlene's level that kept me on the machine and kept questions off me. And to this day, Arlene thinks the summer of '94 was normal. And if she ever reads this, Arlene, I'm sorry, and you keep your chemistry cleaner than any tech I ever met since. Rule 2. Everything printed twice stayed twice. The legal machinery sat above my pay grade. Subpoenas to the store's owner, paperwork through the county attorney's office, things I signed with a detective watching. But the operational end that I lived was simple. When his rolls came through, the negatives got copied before pickup, chain of custody envelope, initialed, dated, driven downtown. He always got his prints. He never got refused, never got shorted, never got a raised eyebrow at the counter. We smiled at him all summer long. Rule 3, and Brandt gripped my forearm the first time he said this one, which from a man that still was a whole speech. I did not follow anything, drive anything, or find anything anymore. My Sundays were over. If a frame put a family in danger, that was his to carry, and he'd carry it. And he did. Quiet, unmarked passes on flagged addresses, patrol notices. Once a family that got a vague and mostly true story about neighborhood prowl reports and left for a convenient 2 weeks at the lake. He dropped 4 rolls between June and August. 4. Different aliases. 2 new names we hadn't seen. Same cash, same doubles, same scratch on every negative. Top third, edge to edge. The loop confirming it each time, while a uniformed officer stood in our stockroom, pretending to be a Pepsi delivery man badly. I met him once before the end. I should say that plainly, because when people hear this story, they always assume the counter arrest was the first time I saw his face, and it wasn't. It was the second. Roll 7, the third Tuesday in July. Deb out with a sick kid, Arlene at the bank, and at 4:10 the tan jacket came up the concourse, and there was nobody at my counter but me. I'd imagined the moment so many times that the real one felt understaffed. He set the envelope on the glass, Reese that week, the slanted handwriting, and said drop off, and I said sure thing, and I did the intake I'd done 9,000 times, and I am here to tell you there was nothing. That's the report. That's the whole horror of the report. Up close, Edwin Roy Galt was a soft-spoken man in his 40s, with a sunburn line across his forehead where a cap usually sat. Drugstore aftershave, clean fingernails, a plant ID on a belt clip turned backwards, and the mild, patient politeness of a guy waiting on carryout. He counted no cash out ahead of time, asked no questions, touched nothing but his own envelope. The single thing I caught, and I only caught it because I was looking the way Brandt had taught me to look. Hands and eyes, nothing else, don't stare. Is that his eyes went once to my name tag, held for about the length of a word, and came back up. That's all. One flick. Reading a label on a piece of equipment. I said ready after 4:30, and he said the 4 words I'd been hearing secondhand since March. I'll just come back. And he walked off toward Dillard's at the pace of a man with nowhere to be. And I held onto the counter for a second, and then I went in the back and called the number I had memorized and said he's here, roll in hand. And the machine hadn't even finished its first bath. The other thing from those weeks I want on the record is the corkboard, because it's where I finally saw the shape of him all at once, instead of a Tuesday at a time. Brandt had me downtown twice in July to walk frames. They'd built the case on a wall, every roll printed 8x10, arranged in columns by location, red yarn and map pins, exactly the way you're picturing it, because that's really how it was done. And my job was sequencing and technical read. Which frames came from the same outing, judging by light and negative order? What lens? Where he'd stood, worked backward from angle and compression. I was good at it, and being good at it in that room felt terrible, and I did it anyway, 4 hours at a stretch. A college dropout with a laser pointer teaching homicide unit men how to read depth of field. At the end of the second session, Brandt stood a long time in front of the column for the yellow house, 17 frames spanning 10 weeks, and said the only thing I ever heard him say about the man that wasn't operational. He said, everybody keeps calling this guy a peeping Tom with a camera. This is a man doing site surveys. And then he took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes and told me to go home the long way, vary the route, and that was the whole goodbye. Go home the long way, vary the route. I did every night, and I'm going to tell you about the last Thursday in July, because it's the piece of this story that never made any report, and it's the piece that cost me the most sleep per ounce. I left at close, took Rock Road south instead of my normal run up Kellogg, and a pale sedan came out of the mall exit 2 cars behind me. It was still there at Harry. Still there when I turned west, which nobody turns, because west on that street goes nowhere a mall shopper goes. I did the thing Brant had taught me for exactly this. 3 right turns, slow, signal everything, and if it's still with you, drive to the Quick Trip on Lincoln and park at the front doors under the lights and go inside and call. Right turn 1, it stayed. Right turn 2, it stayed, and my hands on that wheel stopped belonging to me. Right turn 3, it swung wide, past me, and pulled into a Pizza Hut, and through their front glass I watched a heavy-set dad in a softball jersey walk in and hold up 2 fingers at the hostess, and I sat at the curb across the street until my heart quit slamming. And then I drove to Hayesville and didn't tell Brant for 4 days. Here's why that nothing story earns its place. When I finally did tell him, embarrassed, expecting the reading glasses and a lecture about wasting adrenaline, Brant didn't laugh and didn't reassure me. He wrote down the date, the time, the streets, and the make if I had it, and he filed it, and he said the sentence I've carried out of that whole summer more than any other. He said, "With a man who watches, you never get to find out which times were him." That's the tax. Everybody in those albums has been paying it since, whether they know it or not. Then he bought me a Coke out of the machine, which for Brant was practically a hug, and sent me home the long way again. The content kept moving in one direction. Fewer houses, more people, longer lenses. The Dillons family was gone from the rolls. Brant's people had noticed their absence before I did, and never told me why, and I didn't ask. The bus stop woman was not gone. She was in every role now, her block, her building's parking lot, the numbered stalls, her at her door, keys out, shot from far enough away that she'd never in her life have picked him out of the world, one frame catching her looking almost straight down the lens line. Some sound in the street, a bird, who knows, her face open and unbothered and totally unaware, and I printed that frame at 1 hour speed, and it sat in the catch tray looking up at me, and I had to go stand in the stockroom for a minute among the paper boxes. Brant wouldn't tell me her name. He told me she'd been contacted, which he said in a tone engineered to end the sentence. I've thought about her every day of my life since, and I've never once known what to call her, and I've decided that's right. She gets to be unlisted, even here. And then the first week of August, roll 8, frame 31. I'm riding the correction buttons half hypnotized at 2 in the afternoon, and my own apartment building came down the conveyor. I knew it before I let myself know it. You do. Brick 3-story on hillside north of Kellogg, the dumpster corral, the exterior stairs, my neighbor's window unit dripping down the wall the way it had all summer, and my Civic in the lot, in its spot, frame 32, shot straight on and centered, the parking decal legible on the glass. Frame 33 was the building again at night. Frames 34 through 36 were the mall, our concourse entrance. The lab's backlit sign, 1 hour photo, shot from out in the parking lot through the doors, and standing at the counter inside, a small blur in a red vest, 90% unrecognizable, 100% me. I want to be accurate about what I felt, because I've told this part wrong at parties for years, played it for the gasp. Standing at the machine, what I felt wasn't terror, it was insult. He'd handed it to me. He'd stood in daylight and photographed the person developing his film, and then given me the film to develop. And either he knew exactly what I'd been doing all summer and this was a message, or, and Brant believed this one, and by the end I did too. He had no idea, and I'd simply come up in his rotation. He'd noticed the tech who was always there, young, alone at close. Predictable schedule, name tag, car in the same stall every shift. The truth Brant kept me sitting with is that the second version was worse, and it took me a while to see why. If it was a message, I mattered to him. I was an adversary, a factor. If it was the rotation, then all I was, after 5 months inside his head, after the loop, and the file, and the light panel, All I was to Edwin Roy Galt was another address that hadn't happened yet. I'll give the week after that role its own paragraph, because it deserves one and only one. Brant moved fast and quiet. My Civic started parking in a different stall, one visible from the mall security office, and a mall cop named Gene, who was told a fraction of a version of the truth, walked me out at every close for the rest of the summer, talking about the Royals the entire way, every night, God bless him. I stopped sleeping at my apartment. Officially, I was cat-sitting for a cousin in Hayesville, which is what my mom still believes. And my mom reads everything I write, so... Mom, there was no cat, and I'll explain when you call. The apartment itself got 2 drive-bys a shift from patrol, and Brant walked my building's lot with me once, at noon, and stood where the frame said Galt had stood, and measured nothing, and wrote nothing, and just looked for a while at the sight line to my window. He never told me what he concluded. I never asked. There are conversations you can tell were had entirely so a 22-year-old would witness them and feel the department's weight, and it worked, and knowing it worked never made it work less. The strangest part of that week wasn't fear anyway. It was the counter, because the counter didn't stop. Vacation rolls, a christening, a girl's 15th birthday, a man's retirement dinner at the Petroleum Club, hour after hour of Wichita handing me its life to develop, and me handing it back with a smile. And the whole time the S-bin held an envelope with my own building in it, printed twice. That was the first time I heard the name, that afternoon, though I've just now broken the order of how I learned things telling you. It happened because Frame 32, my Civic, gave Brant what 6 house rolls hadn't, a reflection. My car sat photographed straight on, and in the driver's window, faint, warped by the curve of the glass, was the shape that took the lab's best printing and the county's best enlarging to pull up, a car across the lot behind him, his own car, a pale Caprice, and a smear at the wheel arch that resolved at the 4th enlargement into most of a Kansas plate. The Caprice came back registered to a name with no spring or summer alias in it. Edwin Roy Galt, 46, of Wichita. An address off South Oliver. 17 years at the same aircraft plant, which if you know Wichita explains the schedule. Second shift builds a lot of free daylight. No record beyond a 1981 trespass that went nowhere. The man missing from the middle of his own photographs. And here's where every cop show you've ever seen writes the ending wrong, because the ending you're expecting, the door kicked in on South Oliver, couldn't happen. Brant walked me through it at a Brown's on a Sunday, both of us with coffee neither of us drank. A plate reflection put Galt's car in a public parking lot at a mall. Everything else, the scratch, the aliases, the timeline against the break-ins, was strong and circumstantial, and made of things a first-year defense attorney would feed to a jury as a hobby. Search the house on that and find nothing, or find everything and lose it in court. And either way, he's educated now, and the woman on his rolls is still on his rolls, and he knows her stall number. What the case needed, Brant said, was Galt's hands on it. His body, his handwriting, his custody of the camera with the burr in the gate, all of it at once, in front of witnesses. Then he looked at me over the reading glasses and said the thing we'd both been circling since June. He has to come back to the counter. He always has to come back. It's the one place in the world we know he'll stand still. Envelope, G. Sutter. No phone number. 24 exposures. Kodak Gold, 200. 4x6, glossy, double. Roll 9 came in on Tuesday, August 9th. He'd cycled back to the first alias, which Brant said meant nothing, and I've always believed meant he was finishing something. Tuesdays, by the way. It was always Tuesdays, all summer, every drop and every pickup, and it took me until July to understand why. And the reason is so small and so human that it still makes my skin crawl worse than anything else about him. Doubles were free on Tuesdays. That was it. That was the whole reason. He was working through a list of houses with sleeping families inside, and he scheduled it around a photo promotion, because why would you pay for the second set? I ran roll 9 at 4 in the afternoon with Brant's Pepsi man in the stockroom, and it was the shortest hour of my summer, and I called Brant from the back phone before the prints were dry. Half the roll was the woman. Her building at night, 3 exposures, 1 lit window, hers. I didn't know it was hers, and Brant's silence when I described it told me. Her parking stall, empty, time-stamped by the light at what had to be mid-morning, which meant he'd stood in her lot after she left for work and known he had all day. And then frame 19, and frame 19 wasn't shot from a car, and it wasn't shot from across a street. Frame 19 was a door, filling the frame dead on from maybe 4 feet. The number plate, the peephole, the knob, and the lock. The lock centered, in focus, close enough to read the brand stamped on the cylinder. Whatever building hallway that was, he'd been standing in it. Brant didn't say much on the phone. He said copy everything twice and get the envelope in the bin under S. And he said Galt would come back Tuesday, because Galt always came back Tuesday. And then he said, mostly to himself, in a flat voice I hadn't heard him use, 1 week. And then he hung up on me, which he'd never done, and I stood in the stockroom holding the receiver among the paper boxes, and understood that the schedule had just changed, somewhere above me. What had changed, I learned later, was that Brant had spent July building a second case in parallel, and hadn't told me, because Rule 3 ran in both directions. The spring break-ins had physical evidence, latent fingerprints, including a clean set lifted off the cover of the photo album that had been moved to the kitchen table in the yellow house. Unmatched all spring, Galt's only record was the old trespass, and the print card from 1981 had been filed under a clerical error that took 3 weeks of a July I knew nothing about to untangle. On Friday, August 12th, the latents off the Yellow House album matched Edwin Roy Galt's left hand. On Monday the 15th, a judge signed the warrants, his person, his residence, his caprice, and Brant made the decision he later testified to in 1 sentence. Rather than serve it at the plant or the house, he'd take Galt at the one location where the man would arrive carrying his connection to the aliases in his own hand. The counter, my counter, Tuesday. He briefed me at the Brahms again, Monday night, and this brief was different. Short sentences, no coffee. My only job was the job. Ring him up, hand him the envelope, count his change slow if I could do it naturally, don't if I couldn't. There'd be a couple in front of the airbrush shop, a man at the Walden Books spinner rack, the Pepsi man, others I wouldn't make. Nothing would happen until the envelope was in Galt's hand. Possession, alias, handwriting, transaction, witnesses, all of it together in one motion. And when it happened, my move was 1 step back from the counter and none of my business. Then he asked if I wanted out, said Deb could work the register and nobody would blink, and he asked it in a way that made clear both answers were respectable. I said the person who'd looked at every frame since March should be the one standing there. What I didn't say, because I'd have had to explain it, is that Galt had put me in his rotation. I was an address to him. I wanted one time before it ended to be the counter instead. The week between the 9th and the 16th is the longest week I've ever worked, and nothing happened in it, which is what made it the longest. 7 days of running the machine with my back straight. Every tan jacket on the concourse, and it turns out August in a mall is wall-to-wall tan jackets, I counted. It kept me sane. Every one of them got the same half-second of my attention, hands and eyes, and none of them were him, because he was never early and never off schedule, not once. All summer. Wednesday, I recut a stranger's negatives crooked for the first time since training and had to reprint the strip on my own dime. Thursday, the tornado sirens ran their noon test, and I put a tray of somebody's honeymoon face down on the counter before my brain caught up to what the sound was. Friday, Brant called the back line just to say the word steady and hung up. Saturday and Sunday I was off, and I spent both days at the cousin's place in Hayesville watching a marathon of nothing on TBS with the phone on the couch next to me. Monday was the Brahms briefing, and then it was Tuesday. Tuesday, August 16th, 1994. Doubles Day. He came at 4:10 in the afternoon, which was his slot all summer, after first shift traffic and before dinner, and I watched him come up the concourse the whole way, past the airbrush shop, past the couple studying t-shirts, tan jacket in August, medium everything, a man who matched the average of every man in Kansas, and he reached my counter and said the name, Sutter, picking up. I'd rehearsed my hands more than my face. The bin, the envelope, the register. He watched me the way he'd watched me on frame 36 probably, the red vest blur at the counter, nothing behind his eyes but process. And I rang $3.99 plus tax, and he put a 5 on the counter, and I gave him his change, and I set the envelope down on the glass, and his hand closed on it. I stepped back. I'd love to tell you it was loud, but the truest thing I can tell you about the arrest of Edwin Roy Gault is that most of the mall never noticed. The couple from the t-shirt shop crossed 12 feet of concourse already holding badges. The Walden Books man came in on his flank, and there was one short scuffle of shoes on tile. He twisted once, hard, toward the concourse doors in the parking lot, toward the Caprice, and then he was on the tile with a knee in his back and his cheek flat against the floor of the mall he'd photographed from outside, and the envelope with his alias in his handwriting lay on the glass with his prints fresh on it, in my chain of custody until the second I'd set it down. Deb was on a smoke break. Arlene came out of the back at the noise, took one look and said, to nobody, to the whole summer, what in the world? And the county attorney's office would spend the next 8 months answering her. The Caprice sat in the east lot, nose out, in sight of our doors. I never saw inside it, and I'm glad, same as I was glad every time this story spared me a room. The inventory came out at the preliminary hearing, and it did the convicting, honestly, more than I did. In the trunk, a Canon A1 with a 200mm zoom. The gate burr matched our strips under the county's microscope, and I'll admit the photography student in me registered, in the middle of everything, that it was a nice camera. A gym bag holding gloves, a pry bar wrapped in a towel, and a ring of assorted keys. A Rand McNally Wichita Street Atlas with pages soft from use and nothing marked in it, because the marking was all somewhere else. The marking was in the albums. 3 photo albums, the kind with the sticky pages under plastic film, organized by address. 1 set of prints per frame, some frames annotated in grease pencil with times, and single words the prosecution read into the record one by one, while the courtroom got quieter and quieter. That was set 1. Set 2, and the detectives genuinely did keep asking about this, Brandt told me in the interviews where Gault said almost nothing. Set 2 was in a footlocker at the house on South Oliver. Every second print from every double order, untouched, still in our envelopes, our lab's stamp on every flap, in date order going back past March, back before us, back through envelopes from a Walgreens on West Central and a grocery lab in Darby, 3 years of Tuesdays. The working set and the kept set. He never explained the kept set. He never explained anything. 41 days of proceedings, and the man said in total, I'd guess, 200 words. They tied him to the 3 spring incidents with the album annotations, the latents, and the pry bar's tool marks, and to 2 more from 1993 nobody had ever connected, and the county attorney charged the woman's file, the hallway, the door, the lock, as aggravated stalking under the statute Kansas had passed brand new just 2 years before, which meant her name stayed out of it, which I choose to believe is why he pleaded when he did. In March of 1995, Edwin Roy Gault took a deal on the burglaries, the stalking count, and 2 other counts I only understood the weight of when I saw the number. 40 years, no parole eligibility inside 25. He was 46. The Eagle ran it on page 1 of Metro with a photo of the mall entrance, and Arlene taped the article inside the stockroom door, over my objection, and it stayed there until the lab closed in 2001. Arlene deserves her own paragraph before I let this go. She found out everything in one afternoon. The summer, the copies, the Pepsi man, my locker file, all of it. From a county attorney's investigator with a subpoena for, among other things, the contents of the reject drawer, which she'd been dutifully counting against paper inventory all year with 3 of my flagged strips sitting in it. She didn't speak to me for 2 days, and I let her not, because she'd earned the silence. I'd run an operation inside her lab, under her chemistry, past her face, for a whole summer. On the third day, she came in early, put a cup of Quick Trip coffee on the machine for me, and said one thing about all of it, ever. She said, "Next time, you tell me, because I'd have watched the counter better than any cop." And she was right, and I said so, and that was the end of it. And when I finished my degree the next year, the frame on my graduation photo came from her, and the print inside it, I noticed, was corrected perfectly. The rest is short. The bus stop woman moved, before the plea, with help. That's everything I know and more than I should say. The Yellow House family stayed and repainted, and I know that because I drove past one last time in the spring. Old habit, 15 miles an hour, and there were kids in the yard and the dog run had a dog in it. Deb kept working mornings. I went back to Wichita State in the fall of '95, finished the photography degree, and I've spent 30 years since shooting weddings and school portraits and other things people love and can't believe. And I've never once developed a stranger's film again. And I check my own negatives for gate scratches every single year, and there's no reason for that, and I do it anyway. Brant retired in 2000. At his party, he invited me, which I'll never get over. He told me the case file's official name, some number, and then the name the unit actually used for it all through that summer. They called it Double Prints, because of the promotion, because he only ever came on Tuesdays, because the whole thing, start to finish, got broken by a man too careful to leave fingerprints anywhere but too cheap to pay full price for his second set. 1 hour photo, double prints every Tuesday. One set was his, the other set was always ours. This is one of the most recent encounters I've had. Last night was a cold one, even for South Carolina, and my friend and I had just come from downtown Charleston. Oddly enough, we were on the hunt for any unnatural things, hoping that we'd attract yet another set of terrifying or suspenseful circumstances. Suffice it to say, our wish had been granted. So, without further ado, let's begin. My friend and I had a long day, filled to the brim with fun and adventure, investigations, and whimsical things. After we had spent most of the day in the downtown portion of Charleston, enjoying the frigid breeze and watching the rough waters roll against the docks, we decided it was best to head back before nightfall. Some time had passed, and we eventually arrived back in our city of Somerville, but our appetite for the supernatural and otherworldly hadn't been sated just yet, so we decided to drive around and look at a newer town that had just been added close to us, the town of Summers Corner. It was a nice town, sure enough, but the energy there had just felt weird. Atmospherically speaking, it was heavy and almost suffocating. That wouldn't deter us, as we're quite a resilient bunch, always moving forward, keeping a smile on our face, even if the circumstances are pure unadulterated agony. About half an hour into the drive, we discovered a street called Navajo Boulevard, which had immediately piqued our interests, as the name itself is similar to the Native American tribes of the Navajo people, the exact people who hold within their traditions one of the most scariest entities to haunt our world, the Skinwalker. So, we start to drive down the road. It's dark, and the energy there is thicker than the rest of the road. We had our windows down, so we could truly feel the atmosphere and its energy, its vibrancy, and we were not disappointed. Immediately, we felt watched, not by multiple things, but one entity. This thing did not want us there, at all, and we felt it come closer to us. Its presence was intimidating, quite malicious as well, and it put us on edge, our eyes peeled and ourselves readied for whatever might happen next. The night grew quiet, all the noise ceased, and the silence fell around the surrounding area. Where there had been no prior wind before, a heavy gust slammed itself into the side of my car and nearly shoved it off its left side. That's when we knew this was no mere entity. Just then, we saw a face in the front of our flickering headlights, grotesque, reddened with malice and spiteful things. Its eyes, as pale and silver as the moon, gazed into our souls, sending nothing but fear throughout our entire bodies. We were motionless now, ourselves shrinking into our seats as this abomination grew closer and manifested more into view. It unhinged its jaw and let out a horrific scream, much like from the first one I heard, of a dog's bark, a goat's bleat, and additionally, a fox's scream and an eagle's soaring screech. Enough was enough. I put the car into reverse and we drove the hell out of there. Unfortunately, the feeling was only intensified as we got back onto the road and sped away. The intensity and dread grew ever more as it gained speed. Another gust of wind slammed into the car. Suddenly, my friend yelled for me to look out the window, right behind my seatbelt on the outside of the car. That's when I saw this awful thing in its entirety. Reddish, pale skin, eyes that seemed to have no end, with goat and reptilian-like slits in the pupils. Two stubby little horns adorned its head, sprouting out from atop the brow ridge and rising just above its forehead. It opened its mouth and revealed rows of sharp, gnarled teeth. A hand with long, stained claws scratched at the glass, making us scream to high heaven. My foot pressed the gas pedal as hard as it could. As we were about to drive out of the neighborhood, the thing smiled at us and faded away. The breeze scattering the leaves on the road against where it had been perched on my car's side. It was gone, but we heard a very audible whisper tell us that it'd be back real soon. Then it was quiet again, the heavy energy subsiding and gaining some neutrality as the night dragged on. All of this goes to show us, my friend and I, that just because we've experienced our fair share of unnatural things, and even more together, that there's always something out there waiting to show us more of the true world we live in, the world that we share with these entities, beings that cross from their veil into ours. So I used to live in northern Arizona, in a town called Page. The town is on Lake Powell and nearby Horseshoe Bend, which are both massive tourist attractions recently. It also happens to border the Navajo Reservation, and has a population that is majority native. I'm currently 18. I moved away less than a month ago, so I lived my whole life in the town, essentially. I have heard stories, many stories from my friends, their parents as well, but these two stories are my actual experiences. The first story happened a year and a half ago. Since Page is a 60-mile drive from the next closest town, the nearby area is very popular among locals for jackrabbit, coyote, and bobcat hunting. This particular day, I was out on my own, pretty far back on some local dirt trails. Pretty recently after, I started hunting myself. My target was coyotes. This was before I had a call, so I had to look for them or bait them. And my firearm was a Springfield Saint AR-15, loaded with American Eagle 55 grain AP shells, which, yes, is an important detail. It was probably around noon, and I had wandered down into the wash that ran up into and across the bottom of one of the sandstone cliff sides of the area. While walking through the wash, I scared probably the biggest coyote I had ever seen up the side of the cliff face. As it was scaling, I took 3 shots at it, and I was able to hit at least one because it started bleeding as it made its way up and over the top of the hill cliff. I gave pursuit and probably scaled the face in 3 to 4 minutes of winded climbing. At the top, the cliff turned into a flat mesa, covered by shrubs and dried up bushes, probably about knee-high at most, with no coyote in sight. I started to follow the blood trail. After about 20 minutes of following, I was confused and somewhat concerned. The trail was still thick. Too much was being spilt to allow the coyote to continue in a straight sprint for that long, and I was hunting with the round that would drop a mountain lion in its tracks. After about 10 more minutes, the tracks from the coyote met up with the tracks from what I'm assuming were goat tracks. This is where I turned and got the hell out of there. Both of the tracks were recent, deep, and the sand was still loose enough to fall when I kneeled down to take a look at them. The tracks split from each other, the coyotes going far off to the left, and the goats going to the right. The blood trail, though, no longer followed the tracks of the coyote, but instead indicated that the goat had been shot. The tracks led down into another wash, known in the area for being bad news, so I got back to my truck fast after that. The second story took place near the outskirts of town and has a video that comes with it. My friends and I were out around 10 at night near one of the local jogging trails. At the edge of one of these trails, a storm drain tunnel sticks out. We used to joke about skinwalkers using it to hide from joggers or bikers, but had never paid it much attention. This night though, we decided to go into the storm drain to see for ourselves. I, of course, was the first one in, and had 5 people behind me. We were probably 300 feet in when I heard what sounded like claws scraping against the concrete ahead of me. I could only see about 50 feet in front of me with my light, so I shushed everyone behind me. As soon as we got quiet, a moan resonates through the tunnel. I had never backtracked on all fours so fast in my life. The storm drain leads to a nearby road, which the people who were too scared to go into the tunnel were looking at, but they were not on the road or anywhere near the opening of the road, and were taking Snapchats at the time of the noise, showing us that 1, it wasn't them, and 2, there were no cars on the road at the time. I can't prove these were skinwalkers, but they definitely weren't any person or animal I've ever encountered in my lifetime. Here's the video.